The hospital doors exploded inward at 11:47 p.m., not opened, detonated, as six operators in full tactical gear stormed through like the building was hostile territory. Staff scattered, alarm shrieked, and every gun barrel in that corridor swung toward one person, Margaret Flynn, the 57-year-old night nurse everyone called the Ghost, because she was so easy to ignore. She stood frozen, coffee trembling in her scarred hands, while the team leader, face painted, rifle raised, locked eyes with her and did something that made the entire ER stop breathing. He lowered his weapon, dropped to one knee, and said two words that shattered everything anyone thought they knew about the quiet woman who emptied bedpans and took abuse without complaint. "Commander, ma'am, before we dive into Margaret's story, hit that subscribe button, drop a comment with your city name so I can see how far this story travels, and stick with me until the very end. Because what happens next will change everything you think you know about courage." Margaret Flynn had been invisible for 16 years. She moved through the corridors of Lakewood General Hospital in Crestview Falls like a shadow that no one bothered to notice, refilling IV bags, charting vitals, cleaning up after doctors who wouldn't remember her face if their licenses depended on it. At 57, she had perfected the art of disappearing in plain sight. Gray scrubs that hung loose on her thin frame, hair pulled back in a bun so tight it looked painful, eyes that stayed down, voice that stayed quiet, hands that stayed busy. The night shift suited her. Fewer people, fewer questions, fewer chances for someone to look too closely. Tonight was supposed to be ordinary. Another 12 hours of fluorescent lights and beeping monitors and the particular smell of industrial disinfectant that never quite masked the underlying scent of sickness. She'd already made her rounds on the fourth floor, checked on Mr. Kowalski's oxygen levels, adjusted Mrs. Chen's pain medication, documented everything in the charts with handwriting so precise it looked typed. Now she stood at the nurse's station, logging her final notes before the shift change. The coffee in her hand had gone lukewarm an hour ago, but she sipped it anyway. Waste was waste. "You're still here?" Margaret didn't flinch at the voice, though it carried the same edge it always did. Dr. Brandon Carlisle stood 3 feet away, arms crossed, expensive watch catching the light. 42 years old, Harvard Medical School graduate, and chief of emergency medicine for exactly 9 months. He had the kind of face that people called distinguished. Sharp jaw, perfect teeth, hair graying at the temples in a way that made him look seasoned rather than old. He also had the kind of ego that turned competence into cruelty. "Just finishing my charting, Dr. Carlisle," Margaret said quietly, not looking up. "Your shift ended 20 minutes ago." He tapped his watch. "I don't pay overtime for nurses who can't manage their time." "You don't pay anything," Margaret thought. "Administration does." But she said, "Yes, sir. I'll clock out now." She saved her notes, logged out of the system, and stood. Her knees protested. 16 years of 12-hour shifts had turned her joints into rusty hinges, but she kept her face neutral. Pain was private. "Margaret," she paused, turned, waited. Carlisle studied her with the same expression he used when reviewing x-rays of unremarkable fractures. "You know, there are younger nurses who could use these hours, faster ones, more engaged." The implication hung in the air like smoke. Margaret's grip tightened on her empty coffee cup. "I understand, sir." "Do you?" He stepped closer, lowering his voice to the register he probably thought sounded concerned rather than condescending. "Because I'm trying to help you here. This job, it's demanding, physical. Maybe it's time to consider less strenuous options. Administrative work, part-time, even retirement. Translation: you're old, you're slow, you're in the way." Margaret had heard variations of this speech before, from supervisors who saw gray hair and assumed incompetence, from doctors who mistook quiet for stupid, from patients who demanded younger, prettier nurses because they associated beauty with capability. She'd stopped fighting it years ago. "I'll think about it," she lied. Carlisle smiled, satisfied. "Good. Now go home, get some rest. You look exhausted." He walked away before she could respond, white coat billowing behind him like a cape. 2 residents trailed in his wake, laughing at something he'd said, their voices echoing down the hallway long after they'd turned the corner. Margaret stood alone at the nurse's station, the hum of medical equipment her only company. She didn't look exhausted. She looked haunted, but nobody ever looked closely enough to tell the difference. The break room was empty when Margaret retrieved her bag from her locker. She changed out of her scrubs and into the plain clothes she'd worn that morning: jeans, a faded blue sweater, sneakers with orthotic inserts. The locker door had a small mirror on the inside, and for just a moment she caught her own reflection. Tired eyes, lines around her mouth that hadn't been there 2 decades ago, scars on her hands that she usually kept hidden under gloves. She closed the locker quickly. The back exit was her preferred route. Fewer people, less chance of small talk. She pushed through the heavy metal door and stepped into the night. Rain hammered down in sheets, turning the parking lot into a maze of puddles and shadows. The wind carried the smell of wet asphalt and distant pine trees. Margaret pulled her jacket tighter and headed toward her car, an ancient Honda Civic that had seen better decades. Her shoes splashed through water, her breath fogged in the cold air. She was halfway across the lot when the sound reached her. Not the rain, not the wind. Rotors. Margaret stopped walking. The sound grew louder, a heavy rhythmic thumping that vibrated in her chest. She looked up just as 2 helicopters dropped below the cloud cover, running lights blazing against the storm. Military birds. Blackhawks. They circled the hospital once, twice, and then banked hard toward the main entrance. Her pulse quickened. Something was wrong. Margaret turned and ran back toward the building, ignoring the pain in her knees, the rain soaking through her clothes, the voice in her head that said, "This isn't your problem anymore." She burst through the front entrance just as the helicopters touched down in the ambulance bay. The automatic doors were still closing behind her when she heard the shouting. "Lock it down! Move! Move! Move!" 6 figures emerged from the aircraft, full tactical gear, rifles raised, moving with the kind of precision that came from hundreds of hours of training. They weren't military police. They weren't regular soldiers. They were operators. The lobby erupted into chaos. Staff screamed. Security guards fumbled for their radios. A visitor dropped to the floor, hands over his head. And through it all, the 6-man team advanced with mechanical efficiency, scanning corners, checking sight lines, treating the hospital like a hot zone. Margaret pressed herself against the wall, heart hammering. The team leader was easy to identify, taller than the rest, broader through the shoulders, face paint streaking his jaw in patterns designed to break up his silhouette. He moved to the center of the lobby and spoke into his radio, voice cutting through the panic like a blade. "Ground floor secured. No hostiles. Proceeding to objective." Objective? Margaret's blood went cold. The team swept past the reception desk, past the gift shop, past the terrified administrative assistant who'd plastered herself against a wall. They moved in formation, 2 on point, 2 covering angles, 2 bringing up the rear. Professional, lethal. And they were walking straight toward her. Margaret's mind raced. Wrong place, wrong person. They're looking for someone else. But the team leader's eyes locked onto hers from 30 feet away, and she knew. Oh God. They found me. She could run. The back exit was 20 yards behind her. She could disappear into the rain, into the night, into the carefully constructed invisibility she'd built over 16 years of hiding. Her feet didn't move. The team leader closed the distance in seconds. Up close, she could see he was younger than she'd thought, maybe 35, with eyes that had seen things most people only experienced in nightmares. He stopped 2 feet away, rifle still in his hands but pointed at the floor. The entire lobby went silent, and then he did something that made Margaret's chest tighten. He lowered his head. Not a nod, not a casual greeting, a gesture of respect. "Ma'am, he said, and his voice carried the weight of recognition. Behind him, his team stood at attention. Margaret heard someone laugh, high, nervous, disbelieving. Dr. Carlyle pushed through the gathered staff, face red, authority reasserting itself now that the initial shock had worn off. "What the hell is this?" he demanded. "This is a hospital, not a war zone. You can't just storm in here." The team leader didn't look at him. "Sir, I need you to step back." "Step back? Do you have any idea who I am? I'm the chief of emergency medicine, and I'm telling you." "Sir." The word was quiet, but it carried enough steel to make Carlyle's mouth snap shut. "This is a priority operation, Secure the floor, now. One of the other operators stepped forward, already speaking into his radio. We need a perimeter. 4th floor, east wing, medical personnel only. Everyone else clears out in the next 60 seconds. The staff scattered like leaves in a hurricane. Carlyle sputtered. You can't just... This is my hospital. Margaret moved. Not fast. Not dramatic. She simply reached up, unclipped her ID badge from her jacket, and set it down on the reception desk with a soft click. The sound carried in the silence. She turned to the team leader, and when she spoke, her voice was different. Not the quiet, apologetic tone she'd used for 16 years. Not the voice of a woman who'd learned to make herself small. This was the voice of someone who'd given orders in places where hesitation meant death. How bad is he? The team leader's jaw tightened. Critical, multiple GSWs. We've got maybe 10 minutes before... Bring him in. It wasn't a request. The team leader nodded once, sharp and immediate. Yes, ma'am. He turned and signaled to the helicopters. Within seconds, a stretcher was being rushed through the doors, surrounded by medics whose hands were already slick with blood. The wounded man on it was barely conscious, his tactical vest torn open, field dressings turning red faster than they could absorb. Margaret's eyes swept over him, cataloging injuries, calculating odds, making decisions that most doctors would need 5 minutes and 3 consultations to reach. Trauma Bay 2, she said. Clear it. I need a surgical team, 4 units of O negative, and someone who knows how to intubate without killing the patient. The medics moved without question. Carlyle found his voice. Wait, you can't... You're a nurse. Margaret turned to him, and for the first time in 16 years, she let him see exactly who she was. I'm a field surgeon, she said quietly. 8th Special Operations Medical Group. 15 years in the sandbox. I've put 73 operators back together in conditions that would make your sterile ER look like a spa. So when I tell you to clear that bay and get me a surgical team, you do it. Now. The color drained from Carlyle's face. Margaret walked toward the trauma bay, and the soldiers fell into step behind her like an honor guard. Behind them, Carlyle stood frozen, his carefully constructed authority crumbling like wet paper. And in the parking lot, hidden among the shadows and rain, 3 men in dark clothing watched the hospital with predatory patience. They'd been waiting for Margaret Flynn to surface for 6 years. Now that she had, they were going to finish what they'd started in Kandahar. The trauma bay exploded into controlled chaos. Margaret scrubbed in at the sink, muscle memory guiding her hands through motions she'd performed 1,000 times in tents, bunkers, and the backs of helicopters. The water ran red. She didn't look away. Behind her, the wounded operator, call sign Hawk, according to the team leader, was being transferred onto the surgical table. His vitals screamed from the monitors, blood pressure crashing, heart rate erratic, oxygen saturation dropping. Talk to me, Margaret said without turning around. The team medic, a compact woman with steady hands and a Baltimore accent, rattled off the injuries like a grocery list. 3 GSWs, 1 through and through in the left shoulder, 1 lodged near the liver, 1 that nicked the femoral artery. We've got pressure on the bleeder, but it's not holding. Lost approximately 2 liters in the field. Started fluids, but we're losing ground. Margaret dried her hands, snapped on surgical gloves, and approached the table. Hawk's eyes were half open, pupils dilated, chest heaving with the effort of breathing. He couldn't have been more than 28. Someone's son. Someone's brother. Hey, Margaret said, leaning close enough for him to hear. You're in a hospital. You're safe. I'm going to fix you, but I need you to stay with me. Can you do that? His lips moved. No sound came out, but she read the word anyway. Yes. Good man. She straightened and scanned the room. 2 nurses she recognized, competent, quick, used to trauma. 1 resident who looked like he might vomit, and Dr. Carlyle standing in the corner with his arms crossed, watching her with an expression that oscillated between disbelief and fury. Margaret ignored him. I need a number 10 scalpel, irrigation, and suction ready. Get me an ultrasound to confirm the liver trajectory. And someone page doctor. Ramos, if that artery's damaged worse than it looks, we're going to need vascular. The nurses moved instantly. The resident didn't. Are you deaf? Margaret snapped. He jumped. I, I'm not sure I should. You should either help or leave. Decide in the next 3 seconds. He grabbed the ultrasound machine. Margaret positioned herself at Hawk's side, studying the wound over his liver. The bullet had entered just below the rib cage, angled upward. Dangerous trajectory. If it had clipped the hepatic vein or portal vein, he'd bleed out before they could get him to a proper OR. But she wasn't in a field hospital in Kandahar anymore. She had real equipment, real light, real supplies. She could do this. Scalpel. The nurse placed it in her palm. The weight was familiar, comforting. Margaret cut. The incision was clean, precise, guided by thousands of hours of experience. Blood welled up immediately, but she'd expected that. Suction cleared her field of view. The ultrasound confirmed what she'd suspected. The bullet had lodged against the liver capsule, missing the major vessels by millimeters. Lucky, she muttered. Ma'am? The medic asked. He's lucky. Another half-inch and we'd be doing this in a body bag. She worked quickly, carefully, extending the incision just enough to visualize the damaged tissue. The bullet glinted in the overhead light, a small twisted piece of copper-jacketed lead that had nearly ended a life. Forceps. She extracted it in one smooth motion and dropped it into a metal dish with a clink. One down, she said. Let's check that artery. The team moved with her, anticipating needs before she voiced them. It was different from working with regular hospital staff. These people understood urgency. They understood that hesitation killed. Margaret explored the femoral wound, fingers probing gently through damaged tissue. The artery was torn but not severed, a clean laceration that could be repaired if she moved fast enough. I need vascular clamps. And someone tell Dr. Ramos to get here in the next 5 minutes, or I'm doing this repair myself. Carlyle finally spoke. You can't perform vascular surgery. You're not credentialed. Then credential me or get out of my way. The door burst open. Dr. Elena Ramos rushed in, already in surgical gear, eyes wide. I got here as fast as... Margaret? They'd worked together years ago, back when Margaret had first started at Lakewood General, before she'd learned to hide, before she'd decided that being invisible was safer than being seen. Good to see you, Elena, Margaret said without looking up. I've got a torn femoral that needs your magic touch. Ramos moved to the table, assessed the damage in seconds, and nodded. I can work with this. Nice exposure. I learned from the best. They fell into a rhythm that transcended words. Two surgeons who understood that egos had no place in an OR, that the only thing that mattered was the life on the table between them. Clamps went in. Sutures followed. The bleeding slowed, stopped, held. Hawk's vitals began to stabilize. Margaret allowed herself a single breath of relief. Then the lights went out. Not a flicker. Not a brownout. 1 second the trauma bay was brilliantly lit, and the next it was plunged into darkness so complete that Margaret couldn't see her own hands. Emergency generators should have kicked in immediately. They didn't. What the hell, Carlyle started. Quiet, Margaret said. In the darkness, she heard it. The sound that made her blood run cold. Glass breaking. Multiple locations. Coordinated. The team leader's voice cut through the blackness, calm and lethal. We've got movement. East stairwell. Service entrance. Loading dock. Someone had cut the power deliberately, and now they were coming inside. Margaret's hands were still in Hawk's abdomen, holding pressure on a vessel that couldn't afford to re-bleed. She couldn't move, couldn't run, couldn't even reach for a weapon, but her voice was steady when she spoke. How many? At least 6, maybe more. Rules of engagement. Anyone not hospital staff is hostile. Margaret turned her head toward where she remembered the medic standing. Do you have a sidearm? Yes, ma'am. Give it to me. She heard the sound of a holster being unclipped, felt the weight of a pistol pressed into her hand. Glock 19, 15 rounds. She checked the chamber by feel, loaded, safety off. Elena, Margaret said quietly, can you take over here? Ramos's voice shook. Margaret, what are you... Can you finish this repair? A pause. Then, yes. Good. On my mark, I'm going to transfer pressure. You clamp above and below. Don't let him bleed. Okay. Margaret counted down. 3, 2, 1. Mark. She pulled her hands free, and Ramos's moved in immediately. The transition was seamless. Margaret stepped back from the table, pistol held low and ready. Emergency lights flickered on, battery backups, dim and red. They cast the trauma bay in shades of crimson. The team leader materialized beside her. "Ma'am, you should stay here. We can— How many exits from this bay?" "2, main door and the supply corridor. They'll stack on both, standard breach protocol." Margaret moved toward the door, checking angles, calculating fields of fire. "Your team, where are they positioned?" "2 on the 4th floor perimeter. 2 securing the stairwells, 1 with the bird." "So you're alone here?" "Yes, ma'am." Margaret smiled, but there was no humor in it. Just the cold calculation of someone who'd fought in places where backup was a myth and survival was a skill. "No," she said. "You're not." Outside the trauma bay, footsteps echoed in the hallway. Multiple sets, moving with tactical precision. The team leader raised his rifle. "Ma'am, I really think—" The door exploded inward. 3 men poured through, masked, armed, moving like professionals. They swept the room with military efficiency, weapons tracking, fingers on triggers. And then they saw Margaret. The lead man froze. Behind his mask, she saw his eyes widen. "You," he breathed. Margaret recognized the voice, recognized the scar on his neck that disappeared under his collar, recognized him from a firefight in Kandahar 6 years ago, when she'd been someone different, when she'd made choices that saved lives and ended others. "Hello, Victor," she said calmly. "Still holding grudges, I see." Victor's weapon came up. "You cost us everything, burned our network, killed our people. Your people were trafficking children through military supply lines. I did what needed doing. And now we're going to return the favor." His finger tightened on the trigger. Margaret moved, not away. Toward. She closed the distance between them in 2 steps, faster than Victor expected, faster than his muscle memory could process, and drove the heel of her palm into his wrist. The rifle discharged into the ceiling, plaster rained down. She followed through with an elbow to his throat and a knee to his liver, and Victor dropped like his strings had been cut. The other 2 attackers swung their weapons toward her. The team leader put both of them down with controlled pairs to the chest before they could fire. The gunshots were deafening in the enclosed space. Then silence. Margaret stood over Victor, breathing hard, the pistol in her hand now pressed against his forehead. "How many more?" she asked. He coughed blood. "Enough." "Wrong answer." She shifted the pistol to his knee and raised an eyebrow. Victor's eyes widened behind the mask. "Wait. How? Many. More." 10. 10 more in the building." Margaret holstered the pistol and looked at the team leader. "You heard him. 10 hostiles. They'll try to extract him, secure the wounded operator, and kill anyone who can identify them. Then we need to evacuate. Can't. Moving Hawk now will kill him. We hold here." The team leader nodded slowly. "All right, but ma'am, with all due respect, who the hell are you?" Margaret picked up Victor's rifle, checked the magazine, and cycled the action. "Right now," she said, "I'm the only thing standing between your man and a body bag. Everything else is history." She moved to the door, every instinct from 15 years of combat medicine and close quarters fighting flooding back like she'd never left the desert. Behind her, Dr. Ramos worked frantically to save Hawk's life. And somewhere in the darkened hospital, 9 more killers were hunting for the woman who'd destroyed their organization. Margaret Flynn had been invisible for 16 years. Tonight, she was going to remind the world exactly why some people chose to disappear. The hospital's emergency lighting cast everything in shades of blood and shadow as Margaret moved into the hallway, rifle raised, every nerve alive with the kind of awareness that came from surviving places where complacency meant death. The team leader, his name tape read Morrison, fell into step beside her, weapon tracking opposite angles, their movements synchronized despite never having trained together. Some things transcended preparation. Combat was one of them. "They'll come from multiple vectors," Margaret said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Victor's crew doesn't do anything halfway. If he said 10, assume 12. If he said they want the operator, assume they want everyone in this building dead." Morrison's jaw tightened. Copy that. What's the play? Margaret paused at the intersection of two corridors, scanning left and right. The hospital was a maze of hallways, patient rooms, and service passages, dozens of angles, hundreds of potential ambush points. In a conventional firefight, the defenders would be at a catastrophic disadvantage. But Margaret had never believed in conventional anything. We use the building itself, she said. This hospital has 7 fire suppression zones, 4 emergency lockdown protocols, and a medical gas system that runs through every wall. They're thinking like soldiers. We need to think like surgeons. Morrison stared at her. I'm not following. A surgeon doesn't fight the body. She uses it, redirects what's already there, turns the patient's own resources into the solution. Margaret pointed down the east corridor. That's the main oxygen line for the surgical wing, pressurized, regulated. And if someone knew exactly where to create a rupture and exactly how to ignite it, you could turn an entire floor into a kill box without firing a shot. Understanding dawned in Morrison's eyes. You're talking about controlled demolition. I'm talking about survival by any means necessary. A crash echoed from somewhere above them, metal on tile, followed by shouting. Victor's people were spreading through the building, searching, hunting. Margaret keyed the radio clip to Morrison's vest. All units, this is Flynn. I need a sitrep on the 4th floor. How many civilians still in the building? Static. Then a voice responded. One of Morrison's team, call sign Reaper. 4th floor is clear except for ICU. We've got 8 patients who can't be moved without risking their lives. Medical staff refused to evacuate. Of course they did. Margaret had worked with nurses like that for 16 years. The ones who stayed because leaving meant abandoning people who couldn't protect themselves. Keep them locked down, Margaret ordered. Nobody goes in or out until this is finished. Roger that. Morrison glanced at her. You're giving orders to Spec Ops like you've done it before. I have. Margaret moved toward the stairwell, footsteps silent despite her age. 8th OG doesn't just teach you how to cut. They teach you how to command, how to make decisions when there's no time, no backup, and no margin for error. The rank was captain. The job was keeping your brothers alive when everything went to hell. Was? Margaret's expression hardened. Was. She pushed through the stairwell door, rifle sweeping the vertical space. Empty. For now. They descended quickly, boots barely making sound on the concrete steps. The emergency lights here were spaced farther apart, creating pools of darkness between islands of crimson illumination. Margaret counted floors. Ground level would be chaos, too many exits, too many variables. The basement was where things would get interesting. That's where the hospital kept its infrastructure, power systems, water mains, medical gas regulators. That's where she could turn a building into a weapon. They hit the basement level and paused at the door. Margaret pressed her ear against the metal, listening. Nothing. But absence of sound didn't mean absence of threat. She tried the handle. Locked. Morrison pulled a breaching tool from his vest. On your word. Wait. Margaret holded up a hand, thinking. They'll expect us to breach. They'll have someone covering this door. So what do we do? Margaret smiled grimly. We use a different door. She led him back up half a flight of stairs to a service panel she'd noticed during her years of night shifts. One of those maintenance access points that hospital staff ignored because opening it meant paperwork and inspections. She pried it open with a multi-tool from Morrison's kit, revealing a narrow crawl space that ran parallel to the main corridor. You've got to be kidding, Morrison muttered. You want to walk into an ambush? Be my guest. I'm taking the path they won't expect. She slipped into the crawl space before he could argue, rifle slung across her back, flashlight clenched between her teeth. The space was barely wide enough for her shoulders. Pipes ran along the walls, warm to the touch. The air smelled like dust and electrical insulation. Behind her, Morrison squeezed in, swearing under his breath. They crawled for what felt like an hour but was probably 90 seconds, emerging through another access panel into a storage room filled with janitorial supplies. Margaret eased the panel closed and listened again. Voices close. She killed her flashlight and moved to the door, peering through the small window. 2 men stood in the corridor outside, masked, armed, professional. One was speaking into a radio in a language Margaret recognized, Serbian, Victor's native tongue. No sign on the ground floor, moving to the mechanical room. Margaret's pulse quickened. They were heading exactly where she needed to go. She turned to Morrison and used hand signals. Two hostiles, 20 feet, engaged in conversation. I'll take left, you take right. Suppressed fire, no survivors. Morrison nodded, already attaching a suppressor to his rifle. Margaret counted down on her fingers. 3, 2, 1. They moved through the door like shadows, weapons up, training overriding thought. The two hostiles never saw them coming. The suppressed rounds made sounds like heavy books dropping on carpet. Thump, 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 thump. And both men crumpled. Margaret was already moving forward, checking pulses, confirming the kills. Both dead. Clean shots. Morrison's training was evident. She dragged the bodies into the storage room and closed the door. They had maybe 10 minutes before someone noticed these two weren't reporting in. The mechanical room was 30 feet away, behind a door marked Authorized Personnel Only. Margaret tested the handle. Unlocked. Careless. They slipped inside. The room was larger than most people would expect. A cathedral of pipes, valves, electrical panels, and industrial machinery that kept Lakewood General Hospital running 24 hours a day. The oxygen system dominated one wall. Massive tanks, pressure regulators, distribution manifolds. Enough compressed oxygen to supply 200 beds for a week, or enough to create an explosion that would be visible from orbit. Margaret moved to the control panel, studying the layout. She'd memorized these systems during her first month at Lakewood General, not because she'd planned to weaponize them, but because understanding infrastructure was how you survived when everything collapsed. Knowledge was the ultimate backup plan. Morrison stood guard at the door. How long do you need? 5 minutes to rig it, 3 to set the timer, 2 to get clear. That's 10 minutes we might not have. Then keep them off me. Margaret's hands moved with practiced efficiency, adjusting valves, rerouting pressure, creating a configuration that should never exist in a properly functioning hospital. She was essentially building a fuel air bomb, flooding specific corridors with oxygen, then introducing an ignition source on a delay. The beauty of it was the precision. She could control exactly where the explosion occurred, exactly how much force it generated, exactly who would be caught in the kill radius, assuming she got the calculations right. A single mistake, wrong pressure, wrong timing, wrong valve sequence, and she'd either create a dud or level the entire building with patients still inside. No pressure. Her fingers flew across the controls, muscle memory from a different life guiding her through steps that would seem insane to anyone watching. She was diverting oxygen from the ICU feeds, enough to maintain patient safety but not enough to trigger alarms, and channeling it into the ground floor corridors where Victor's people were searching. The ignition source was trickier. She couldn't use the electrical system. It was too unpredictable. But the hospital's sterilization equipment ran on high-temperature elements that could be remotely activated from the mechanical room. She programmed a 3-minute delay into the system, giving her just enough time to get Morrison and herself clear. Done, she said, stepping back from the panel. When this goes, the entire ground floor east wing is going to light up like the 4th of July. Anyone in that corridor won't have time to scream. Morrison's expression was unreadable. How many civilians in that area? None. I've been working here 16 years. I know which wings are active at night. That corridor is administrative offices and storage. Empty after 7 p.m. You're sure? I'm sure. He nodded slowly. Then let's move. They exited the mechanical room and headed back toward the stairwell. Margaret checked her watch. 2 minutes, 40 seconds until detonation. They made it halfway to the stairs when the radio crackled. All units, this is Reaper. We've got a problem. Multiple hostiles converging on ICU. They're trying to breach the doors. Margaret's blood went cold. How many? At least 4, maybe 5. And they've got shaped charges. If they blow those doors, we won't be able to hold them. Morrison looked at Margaret. The wounded operator is still in the trauma bay. If they get through to ICU, they'll have a straight shot to him. Margaret thought fast. The explosion was set. 2 minutes, 20 seconds. If they tried to reach the ICU now, they wouldn't make it in time. But if they didn't go, Morrison's people and the patients were dead. She made the decision in less than a second. We split up. she said. You get to the trauma bay, reinforce Dr. Ramos. Make sure Hawk stays alive. What about you? I'm going to ICU. Morrison grabbed her arm. Ma'am, with all due respect, you're a 57-year-old surgeon. I can't let you... Margaret pulled free, her voice dropping to a register that allowed no argument. Morrison, I've been keeping people alive in impossible situations since before you could shave. I've performed surgery while under mortar fire, extracted wounded operators from behind enemy lines, and put down hostiles who thought they could intimidate me because I'm a woman. So when I tell you I'm going to ICU, I'm not asking permission. I'm informing you of tactical reality. Now move. He hesitated for one more second, then nodded. Don't get yourself killed. Wasn't planning on it. They separated at the stairwell. Morrison headed up toward the trauma bay. Margaret went the opposite direction, toward the ICU, toward the sound of shaped charges being armed, toward 4 or 5 trained killers who were about to learn that the quiet nurse they'd dismissed for 16 years was the most dangerous person in the building. She ran through the corridors, ignoring the pain in her knees, the burning in her lungs, the voice that said she was too old for this. Age was just a number. Training was forever. 1 minute, 30 seconds until detonation. She could hear them now, voices shouting in Serbian, tools scraping against metal, the distinctive electronic whine of detonation timers being set. They were going to blow the ICU doors and flood in like water through a broken dam. Margaret rounded the corner and saw them. 5 men in tactical gear, 2 planting charges on the reinforced doors, 3 providing cover. She didn't give them time to react. The rifle came up smooth and fast, and she put rounds into the 2 closest men before they could turn. One dropped immediately. The other spun, returning fire wildly, bullets sparking off the walls. Margaret was already moving, using the corner for cover, controlled breathing, sight picture, trigger press. The second man went down. The remaining 3 scattered, training kicking in, seeking cover behind equipment and door frames. One of them shouted into his radio, calling for backup, reporting contact, saying something about the woman that made Margaret's lips twitch into a humorless smile. She ejected the spent magazine and slammed in a fresh one. 45 rounds left. 3 hostiles. Simple math. Except nothing about this was simple. The man on the left broke from cover trying to flank. Margaret tracked him, led the target, squeezed. He stumbled but didn't fall, body armor catching the round. She adjusted, put the next shot through his pelvis where the armor ended, and he went down screaming, 2 left. 1 minute until detonation. The remaining hostiles were smarter. They'd gone to ground using the ICU doors as cover, forcing Margaret to either advance into their kill zone or wait them out. She didn't have time to wait. Margaret pulled a fire extinguisher from the wall mount and threw it hard down the corridor. It clattered and rolled, drawing attention, pulling eyes. In that half-second of distraction, she broke from cover and sprinted forward, rifle blazing, rounds chewing through the air. One hostile took a burst to the chest and folded. The last one managed to get his weapon up, managed to acquire her as a target, managed to start pulling the trigger. Margaret dove, hit the ground, rolled, came up inside his range where rifles were useless, and drove the butt of her weapon into his throat. He choked, gagged, tried to bring his hands up. She followed with a strike to the temple that sent him sprawling. Silence. Margaret stood among the bodies, breathing hard, checking corners by instinct. 30 seconds until detonation. She ran to the ICU doors and pounded. "It's Margaret Flynn! Open up!" The doors cracked open. Reaper stood there, weapon ready, eyes wide. "Jesus Christ, ma'am, you just... No time. Get everyone away from the exterior walls, now." He didn't question her, just turned and started shouting orders. Margaret sprinted back toward the stairwell, counting down in her head. 20 seconds. 15. She hit the stairwell and climbed, legs screaming, heart hammering against her ribs. 10. 5th floor. Keep moving. 5. She dove through a doorway into an empty patient room, hit the floor and covered her head. The explosion was beautiful in its precision, not a chaotic blast, not an uncontrolled detonation. It was surgical, a wave of pressure and flame that rolled through the ground floor east corridor like God's own scalpel, consuming everything in its path. The building shuddered, windows shattered, alarms that had been silent suddenly screamed to life, and in the corridor where Victor's remaining people had been searching, there was nothing left but fire and smoke, and the kind of silence that follows absolute destruction. Margaret lay on the floor for 5 seconds, letting her hearing recover, checking herself for injuries. Nothing serious, some bruises, a scrape on her cheek from hitting the ground. She pushed herself up and keyed the radio. Morrison, sit rep. Static. Then, Trauma Bay is secure. Hawk is stable. Dr. Ramos says another hour, and he'll be ready for transport. Good. Victor's people? I'm counting 7 bodies on the ground floor. Assuming you got the ones at ICU, that's 12 total. Margaret did the math. Victor had said 10. They'd killed 12, which meant either he'd lied or there were more than he'd known about. She was betting on the latter. Stay sharp, she said into the radio. This isn't over. She moved back toward the stairwell, every instinct screaming that something was wrong. The attack had been too straightforward. Victor was many things, but predictable wasn't one of them. That's when she heard it. Helicopter rotors. Multiple birds. Incoming fast. Margaret ran to the nearest window and looked out. 3 helicopters were approaching from the north. Civilian aircraft, but moving in formation, running without lights. Reinforcements. Morrison, she said into the radio, voice tight. We've got company. 3 birds inbound, unknown number of hostiles. Can we get our people out? Margaret watched the helicopters descend toward the hospital's rooftop helipad. Not before they land. We're going to have to... The world turned white. Not an explosion. Not fire. Light. Floodlights from the helicopters, brilliant and blinding, turning the hospital's exterior into a stage. And over the loudspeakers came a voice Margaret hadn't heard in 6 years but would recognize anywhere. Margaret Flynn. I know you're in there. I know what you did tonight, and I know you're alone. It was Victor's voice, but stronger. Not the voice of a man dying from a crushed throat. The voice of a man who'd been playing her from the beginning, the wounded man in the trauma bay, the one Margaret had left behind. He wasn't Victor. He'd been the distraction, the bait, and she'd taken it. You killed my brother tonight, Victor's voice echoed through the loudspeakers, carried across the parking lot, the streets, the entire neighborhood. You think you won? You haven't won anything. You've just made this personal. Margaret's hands clenched on the rifle. Morrison's voice crackled through the radio. Ma'am, we need to evacuate. Now. But Margaret was looking at the helicopters, counting assets, calculating odds. 3 birds. Probably 6 men per bird. 18 fresh hostiles against Morrison's 5-man team and 1 exhausted surgeon. The math wasn't good. Morrison, she said quietly, get Hawk and your people to the basement. There's a service tunnel that runs to the parking structure across the street. Take it. Get clear. What about you? Someone needs to buy you time. Ma'am, that's not... It's an order. She cut the radio before he could argue and moved toward the roof access. The stairwell was narrow, the air cold, her breath fogging in front of her face. She climbed quickly, rifle slung across her back, mind racing through options. She could surrender, walk out with hands up, hope that Victor was professional enough to make it quick, but she'd seen what Victor did to people who crossed him. Quick wasn't his style. She could run, disappear again, become invisible. Let Morrison's team fend for themselves while she vanished into whatever hole she'd crawled out of 16 years ago. But she'd spent 16 years running, 16 years hiding, 16 years pretending to be small and quiet and forgettable. She was done running. Margaret hit the roof access door and stepped out into the night. Rain hammered down in sheets. Wind tore at her clothes. The helicopters hovered 50 feet above the helipad, downdrafts creating cyclones of water and debris. And standing in the center of the pad, arms spread like he was welcoming her home, was Victor. He was bigger than she remembered, broader, older. The scar on his neck had spread, twisted by time and anger, into something that looked like a rope burn. There she is, he shouted over the rotors. The ghost, the legend, the woman who destroyed everything I built. Margaret walked forward slowly, rifle held at her side, not threatening, but not submissive either. You built a trafficking ring, she said, voice cutting through the storm. You sold children. You deserve worse than what I gave you. Victor smiled. And you played judge, jury, and executioner. How very American of you. How very human of me. He gestured to the helicopters. I brought friends. 18 of my best people. You've got, what, 5 soldiers and a bleeding operator? How do you like those odds? Margaret stopped 10 feet from him, rain streaming down her face, rifle barrel drifting up almost casually until it pointed at his chest. I've worked with worse. For a moment, Victor looked uncertain. Then he laughed. You won't shoot me. Not while my people have guns on your friends. One radio call, and they storm that trauma bay. You're right, Margaret said. I won't shoot you. She lowered the rifle. Victor relaxed, and Margaret pulled a detonator from her pocket. His eyes widened. What is that? Insurance, Margaret said. While I was rigging the oxygen system for the ground floor, I set a secondary charge. Roof supports, structural columns. If I press this button, the entire top floor comes down. Your helicopters, your people, you. You're bluffing. Am I? Victor stared at her, trying to read her expression, trying to find the lie. But Margaret had spent 16 years perfecting her poker face. She gave him nothing. If you blow the roof, you die too, he said. I'm 57 years old. I've got arthritis in both knees, scar tissue in my lungs from breathing burn pit smoke, and nightmares that won't quit. If I have to die to stop you, I'll consider it a fair trade. The rain pounded down. The helicopters hovered, and for the first time since Margaret had known him, Victor looked afraid. Last chance, Margaret said. Call off your people. Leave. Disappear. Or I bring this whole building down and we all go together. Victor's hand moved toward his radio. Margaret's thumb moved toward the detonator button. And somewhere in the hospital below, Dr. Carlyle burst into the trauma bay, followed by 6 armed hospital security guards, and found himself staring at Morrison's rifle. Don't move, Morrison said. Carlyle's face was red with fury. What the hell do you think you're doing? This is my hospital. I'm calling the police. I'm calling the board. I'm calling. Shut up, Morrison said quietly. And that's when Carlyle saw the wounded operator on the table, saw Dr. Ramos covered in blood, saw the surgical instruments arranged with military precision, saw the truth he'd been too arrogant to recognize. Margaret Flynn isn't a nurse, Carlyle whispered. Morrison smiled without humor. No, sir, she's not. On the roof, Victor's hand hovered over his radio, and Margaret's thumb hovered over the detonator, and neither of them blinked, and the rain kept falling, and somewhere in the distance, sirens began to wail. The sirens grew louder, cutting through the rain and rotor wash, converging from multiple directions. Victor's eyes flicked toward the sound, then back to Margaret, calculating odds that were shifting by the second. Police, he said. Fire department. Probably FBI by now. You really want to explain all this? Margaret's thumb stayed on the detonator. I've got nothing to hide. You, on the other hand, are standing on a hospital roof with 18 armed men and a helicopter strike team. How do you think that conversation goes? Victor's jaw tightened. His hand was still hovering over the radio, fingers twitching. Margaret could see the calculation running behind his eyes, same look she'd seen in Kandahar when he'd realized his trafficking network was burning and he had seconds to decide between fighting and running. He'd run then. The question was whether he'd learned anything since. You know what your problem is, Flynn? Victor's voice dropped to something almost conversational, like they were discussing strategy over drinks, instead of standing in a Mexican standoff with enough firepower to level a city block. You think you're the hero. You think because you saved some kids and burned some bad people that you're on the side of the angels. I think I'm someone who does what needs doing, Margaret said. The rest is just noise. No, the rest is consequences. Victor gestured to the hospital below. You blew up a building tonight, killed 12 men, turned a place of healing into a war zone. You think anyone's going to care why? Margaret's expression didn't change, but something cold settled in her chest. Because he was right. The moment those police cars arrived, the moment the investigation started, every choice she'd made tonight would be dissected by people who'd never held a scalpel under fire or made decisions when hesitation meant death. She'd be the woman who brought violence into a hospital, the unstable veteran who couldn't let go of the war, the liability. Victor saw the doubt flicker across her face and smiled. There it is. The moment you realize you can't win this, not with detonators, not with guns, not with whatever righteous fury you've been carrying for 6 years. Maybe not, Margaret said quietly, but I can make sure you lose. Her thumb started to press down. Victor's hand shot to his radio. "Stand down! All units, stand down!" Margaret paused, thumb millimeters from triggering the charge. The helicopters began to climb, rotors changing pitch, moving away from the hospital. Victor's people were retreating, pulling back, disappearing into the night like they'd never been there. Victor stared at her with something that might have been respect or might have been hatred. With him, it was hard to tell the difference. "This isn't over," he said. "It never is," Margaret replied. He turned and walked toward the nearest helicopter, which had descended just enough for him to grab the skid and pull himself up. The bird banked hard and climbed, running lights disappearing into the storm clouds. Within 30 seconds, all 3 helicopters were gone. Margaret stood alone on the roof, rain soaking through her clothes, the detonator still in her hand. She looked down at it, just a modified hospital pager with wires running to absolutely nothing. She'd been bluffing the entire time. Sometimes the best weapon was the one your enemy thought you had. She dropped the fake detonator into a puddle and headed back toward the stairwell. Her knees screamed with every step. Her hands were shaking now that the adrenaline was fading. She was 57 years old and had just survived a combat engagement that would have challenged operators half her age. Tomorrow she was going to feel like death. Tonight, she still had a patient to check on. Margaret descended through the hospital, passing staff who pressed themselves against walls when they saw her. Not with fear exactly, but with the kind of wary respect usually reserved for wild animals that had wandered into civilization. She still carried the rifle, still moved with the predatory efficiency of someone who'd spent too long in places where letting your guard down meant dying. She found Morrison outside the trauma bay, standing guard with the kind of relaxed alertness that came from extensive training. He straightened when he saw her. "Ma'am, Victor?" "Gone. For now." Margaret leaned the rifle against the wall, suddenly aware of how tired she was. "How's Hawk?" "Stable. Dr. Ramos says the repairs are holding. He's got maybe a 60% chance if we can get him to a proper surgical center in the next 2 hours." "Then get him moving. The police are going to lock this place down any minute." Morrison nodded slowly. "About that. We've got a problem." He gestured towards the trauma bay doors. Through the small window, Margaret could see Dr. Carlyle standing near the surgical table, arms crossed, face set in an expression of bureaucratic fury. 6 hospital security guards flanked him, armed with nothing more dangerous than pepper spray and misplaced confidence. "He's threatening to press charges," Morrison said. "Terrorism, destruction of property, practicing medicine without proper credentials. He's got a whole list." Margaret felt something cold and sharp settle in her stomach. "Let me talk to him." "Ma'am, I don't think—" "Let me talk to him." Morrison stepped aside. Margaret pushed through the doors and into the trauma bay. The smell hit her first: blood, disinfectant, the metallic tang of spent adrenaline. Hawk was intubated and sedated, his vitals displaying on monitors that beeped with reassuring regularity. Dr. Ramos stood beside the table, her surgical gown covered in blood, her eyes hollow with exhaustion. Carlyle turned when Margaret entered. "There she is, the woman who turned my hospital into a battlefield." Margaret walked to the surgical table and checked Hawk's vitals herself, ignoring Carlyle completely. Heart rate steady, blood pressure acceptable, oxygen saturation holding at 94%. The femoral repair looked clean. The liver wound was packed and draining properly. Good work. Ramos had always been good. "I said," Carlyle started. "I heard you," Margaret said without looking at him. "You want to press charges. You want me arrested. You want to make this about policy violations and proper procedures and the sanctity of your hospital. This isn't about what I want. It's about accountability. You don't get to just—" Margaret turned to face him, and whatever he saw in her expression made him stop talking. "This man," she said, pointing to Hawk, "is 28 years old. He has a wife in Virginia and a daughter who just turned 3. He likes old westerns and terrible punk music, and he can field strip an M4 in under 30 seconds. Tonight he took 3 bullets protecting intelligence assets that will save American lives. And you want to talk to me about accountability?" Carlyle's face flushed. "That's not the point. You violated protocols. You performed surgery without authorization. You brought armed combatants into—" "I saved his life," Margaret said quietly. "Using skills I learned in places where protocol means nothing and the only authorization you need is the ability to keep someone's heart beating. So yes, I violated your policies. I broke your rules. I did things that will probably cost me any chance of working in a hospital again." She stepped closer to Carlyle, close enough to see the fear behind his anger. "But that man is alive because I was here. And if you think I'm going to apologize for that, you don't know me at all." "I'm calling the police," Carlyle said, but his voice wavered. "They're already here," Morrison said from the doorway. "About 40 of them, actually. FBI, too. And they're going to want statements from everyone who was in this hospital tonight." Carlyle's expression shifted from anger to calculation. Margaret could see the wheels turning, figuring out how to spin this, how to position himself as the victim rather than the obstacle, how to come out of this with his reputation intact. "Then we'll tell them the truth," Carlyle said, "that an unstable employee brought violence into this facility and endangered everyone inside." "Or," Morrison said, his voice carrying the weight of someone who'd negotiated with hostile forces in a dozen countries, "you could tell them that when armed attackers stormed this hospital, one of your nurses, a decorated combat surgeon with 15 years of field experience, stepped up and neutralized the threat while keeping a critically wounded patient alive." Carlyle blinked. "What?" "You could be the administrator who recognized talent, who created an environment where expertise could flourish, who supported his staff during a crisis." Morrison's smile was cold. "Or you could be the guy who tried to prosecute a hero because she made you look incompetent. Which story do you think plays better on the news?" The silence stretched. Margaret watched Carlyle's face cycle through emotions: anger, fear, calculation, resignation. He was realizing what Morrison had already figured out. The narrative of this night was going to be told whether he liked it or not, and he could either position himself inside it or get crushed beneath it. "Fine," Carlyle said finally. "But I want a full incident report. I want documentation. I want—" "You'll get everything you need," Morrison interrupted, "after my people are clear. Your people brought this violence here. Victor's people brought the violence. We just finished it." Before Carlyle could respond, the trauma bay doors burst open and 2 FBI agents entered, followed by a Crestview Falls police captain and what looked like half the hospital's administrative staff. The lead FBI agent, a woman in her 40s with the kind of eyes that missed nothing, surveyed the room with professional detachment. "I'm Special Agent Rachel Kwan," she said. "I need everyone to stay exactly where you are while we sort this out." Morrison stepped forward. "Agent Kwan, I'm Lieutenant Commander Morrison, Naval Special Warfare Development Group. This is a classified military operation that resulted in—" "Lieutenant Commander, I don't care if you're the Secretary of Defense. This is a civilian facility on American soil, and 18 bodies just got scattered across 3 floors. So you're going to answer my questions, or I'm going to arrest everyone in this room and sort out jurisdiction later." Margaret almost smiled. Agent Kwan reminded her of officers she'd worked with in the sandbox. Competent, no nonsense, completely unimpressed by rank or reputation. Morrison's expression didn't change. "Then I'm invoking operational security and referring you to my commanding officer at JSOC. This entire incident is classified above your clearance level." "Try again," Kwan said. "I've got top secret/SCI clearance and direct authorization from the deputy director. So unless you want to explain to Congress why Navy SEALs were conducting combat operations in a civilian hospital without proper oversight, I suggest you start talking." The standoff lasted maybe 3 seconds before Morrison made the calculation that Margaret had seen dozens of operators make over the years. Sometimes cooperation was faster than confrontation. "Fine," Morrison said, "but not here. And not with an audience." Kwan nodded. "Conference room, 5 minutes. Bring your medical personnel, too." Her eyes landed on Margaret, especially her. They assembled in a second-floor conference room that smelled like stale coffee and desperation. Margaret sat at the long table, flanked by Morrison on one side and Dr. Ramos on the other. Agent Kwan sat across from them, a digital recorder between them. Her partner, a younger man named Torres, standing by the door with arms crossed. "Let's start simple," Kwan said. "Who is Margaret Flynn?" Morrison opened his mouth to answer, but Margaret spoke first. "I'm a registered nurse at Lakewood General Hospital. Before that, I was Captain Margaret Flynn, 8th Special Operations Medical Group, attached to various JSOC elements for 15 years. I separated from the military 6 years ago and have been working civilian medicine ever since. Kwan's eyebrow rose. And tonight you just happened to be here when a special operations team showed up with a critically wounded operator? Coincidence? I don't believe in coincidence. Neither do I, Margaret said, but it's still what happened. Kwan leaned back, studying her. Walk me through the sequence of events. Everything, from the moment the helicopters arrived. Margaret did. She kept it factual, clinical, stripping out emotion and editorializing. She described the initial breach, the wounded operator, Victor's people attacking, the firefight in the corridors. She explained her decisions, why she rigged the oxygen system, why she split from Morrison's team, why she engaged hostiles instead of evacuating. She left out the part about the fake detonator. Some secrets were worth keeping. When she finished, Kwan was quiet for a long moment. You killed 12 people tonight, the agent said finally. I neutralized 12 hostile combatants who were attempting to murder patients and staff in a civilian hospital, Margaret corrected. There's a difference. Is there? Yes. One is murder, the other is defense. I know which one I committed. Kwan's expression was unreadable. And the oxygen system explosion? That was defense too? That was tactical necessity. Victor's people were armed with military-grade weapons, operating in coordinated teams, and had superior numbers. A conventional firefight would have resulted in massive casualties among hospital staff and patients. I used the resources available to level the playing field while minimizing collateral damage. You turned a hospital into a bomb. I turned one corridor into a controlled burn zone. There's a difference. You keep saying there's a difference. I'm starting to think you're trying to convince yourself as much as me. Margaret met Kwan's eyes without flinching. I don't need to convince myself of anything. I made decisions based on training, experience, and the tactical reality I was facing. If I had to make those same decisions again, I would. The only difference is I'd do it faster. Kwan studied her for a long moment, then turned to Morrison. What's your assessment, Lieutenant Commander? Morrison didn't hesitate. Captain Flynn performed with exceptional skill under extreme circumstances. Her actions saved the life of my operator, neutralized a significant threat, and prevented what could have been a massacre. If I had 50 operators with her capabilities, we'd end the war on terror in 6 months. That's quite an endorsement. It's the truth. Kwan turned to Dr. Ramos. And you? You're a civilian physician. What's your take on all this? Ramos looked exhausted, her hands still trembling slightly from the adrenaline crash, but her voice was steady when she spoke. I've worked with Margaret for 3 years. I've always known she was competent, but tonight I saw someone who operates on a completely different level. The surgical decision she made, the way she managed the trauma, her ability to command under pressure, it was extraordinary. If every surgeon had her training, mortality rates in trauma centers would drop by half. Even though she brought violence into your hospital? She didn't bring anything. Victor brought the violence. Margaret just ended it. Kwan was quiet again, processing. Her fingers drummed on the table, a tell that suggested she was coming to a decision. Here's my problem, she said finally. I've got 18 bodies, 3 floors of damage, a hospital full of traumatized staff, and a story that sounds like a bad action movie. The media is already gathering outside. By morning, this is going to be national news, and someone is going to have to answer for what happened here. Then let me answer, Margaret said. Everyone turned to look at her. I'll take full responsibility, Margaret continued. Tell whatever story you need to tell. Say I went rogue. Say I acted without authorization. Say I'm an unstable veteran who couldn't leave the war behind. I don't care. But Morrison's team walks away clean, and no one touches the patients or staff. Morrison started to protest. Ma'am, that's not... It's the truth, Margaret interrupted. You came here for medical evacuation of a wounded operator. I'm the one who escalated. I'm the one who engaged. I'm the one who rigged the explosion. You were just doing your job. Kwan's expression shifted, just slightly, but enough for Margaret to see the calculation happening behind those sharp eyes. Or, the agent said slowly, I could tell a different story. One where a decorated combat surgeon working as a civilian nurse recognized a threat to her hospital, used her expertise to neutralize that threat, and saved countless lives in the process. A story about a hero who came out of retirement when her country needed her. Margaret felt her stomach tighten. I'm not a hero. Maybe not. But that's the story that plays better on the news. Kwan leaned forward. Here's the deal. You cooperate fully with the investigation. You provide detailed testimony about Victor's organization, his networks, his capabilities. You help us understand who these people are and how to stop them. And in exchange, we make sure the narrative reflects reality, that you're someone who protected Americans when they needed it most. And if I refuse, then I charge you with reckless endangerment, destruction of property, practicing medicine without proper authorization, and about 15 other violations I can think of. You spend the next decade fighting legal battles instead of saving lives. Margaret looked at Morrison, who gave her a subtle nod, looked at Dr. Ramos, who was watching with an expression of quiet hope. What about Carlyle? Margaret asked. Kwan's smile was thin. Dr. Carlyle is going to be very cooperative, because if he's not, I'm going to start asking questions about how armed hostiles gained access to his hospital, about his security protocols, about whether he was negligent in his duty to protect patients and staff, and those questions tend to end careers. Margaret thought about it, about the cost of cooperation, the price of truth, the difference between justice and revenge. All right, she said finally, I'll cooperate, but I want something in return. What? Immunity for everyone who helped me tonight. The nurses who stayed when they should have evacuated. The staff who followed my orders. Dr. Ramos, who performed surgery without questioning my authority. They were just doing what I asked. They don't deserve to be punished for my decisions. Kwan considered this. Done. Anything else? One more thing. Margaret stood, ignoring the protest from her knees. I want Hawk, the wounded operator, transferred to Walter Reed Medical Center under my care. I started saving his life. I'm going to finish the job. Morrison's eyebrows shot up. Ma'am, you can't just... Can I? Margaret asked Kwan. The FBI agent's smile was genuine this time. I think that can be arranged, assuming you're willing to come back to active duty. The room went silent. Margaret stared at Kwan. What? The military has been trying to recruit experienced combat medical personnel for years. Someone with your background, your skills, your operational experience. They take you back in a heartbeat, probably bump you to major, give you a command position at one of the teaching hospitals. I'm 57 years old. Age waivers exist for critical specialties, and combat surgeons definitely qualify as critical. Margaret felt something shift in her chest, a weight she'd been carrying for 6 years starting to lift. The weight of hiding, of pretending, of making herself small enough to disappear. I'll think about it, she said quietly. You do that. Kwan stood, signaling the interview was over. In the meantime, we've got a crime scene to process and about 100 witnesses to interview. Lieutenant Commander Morrison, your people need to stay available for questioning. Understood. And Captain Flynn? Kwan paused at the door. Thank you for what you did tonight. For not running when it would have been easier, for remembering that some things are worth fighting for. Margaret nodded, not trusting herself to speak. The FBI agents left, followed by Dr. Ramos and eventually Morrison, who gave Margaret a sharp salute before heading back to check on his team. Margaret stood alone in the conference room, looking out the window at the chaos below. Police lights painted the parking lot in alternating shades of red and blue. News vans were setting up perimeter positions. Somewhere in that crowd, reporters were already crafting narratives, deciding who the heroes and villains were, packaging truth into something consumable. She thought about Carlyle, about the years of being dismissed and underestimated and treated like she was invisible. Thought about Victor, still out there, still dangerous, still planning his next move. Thought about Hawk, fighting for his life one floor below. Thought about the choice Agent Kwan had offered, return to active duty, step back into the light, stop pretending to be something she wasn't. The door opened behind her. Margaret turned, expecting Morrison or another agent. Instead, she found herself face to face with a man in an expensive suit, flanked by 2 individuals carrying briefcases and the kind of confidence that came from power unchecked by consequences. The man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Captain Flynn, he said. My name is Richard Castellano. I'm the hospital's attorney, and we need to talk about the rather significant liability you've created for Lakewood General tonight. Margaret's hand instinctively moved toward where her sidearm had been, before remembering she'd surrendered all weapons to Morrison's team. Castellano noticed the gesture, and his smile widened. "Oh, I'm not here to threaten you, Captain. I'm here to make you an offer, one that will benefit both of us. You see, what happened tonight, it's going to cost this hospital millions in damages, lawsuits, insurance claims. Unless we can control the narrative, unless we can turn you from a liability into an asset." "I'm listening," Margaret said carefully. "The hospital is prepared to offer you a full-time position as Director of Trauma Services. Generous salary, full benefits, complete autonomy in your department. All we ask in return is that you sign a non-disclosure agreement about tonight's events and agree to participate in a media campaign highlighting the hospital's commitment to veteran care." Margaret stared at him. "You want to turn this into a publicity stunt. I want to turn this into an opportunity for everyone involved. And if I refuse," Castellano's expression hardened, "then the hospital will pursue every legal avenue available to recover damages. We'll paint you as an unstable veteran who brought violence into a civilian facility. We'll make sure you never work in medicine again. We'll make your life so miserable that you'll wish Victor had killed you on that roof." The threat hung in the air like poison. Margaret was quiet for a long moment, letting Castellano think he'd won, letting him believe that she was someone who could be intimidated. Then she smiled. "No," she said simply. Castellano blinked. "Excuse me?" "No. I'm not signing your NDA. I'm not participating in your media campaign. I'm not going to help you profit off of what happened here tonight. You don't understand the consequences. I understand perfectly. You're going to try to destroy me. You're going to file lawsuits and make accusations and do everything in your power to make me disappear. And you know what? You might even succeed." Margaret stepped closer, close enough to see the first flicker of uncertainty in Castellano's eyes. "But before you do, I'm going to give interviews to every reporter in that parking lot. I'm going to tell them exactly what happened tonight, including how Dr. Carlisle tried to fire me hours before I saved his hospital, including how your security protocols were so inadequate that armed hostiles walked in unchallenged, including every single failure that made tonight possible." She paused, letting that sink in. "So go ahead. File your lawsuits. Make your threats. But understand that if you come after me, I'm taking this entire hospital down with me. And unlike you, I have absolutely nothing left to lose." Castellano's face went white. His assistant shifted uncomfortably. And in that moment, Margaret saw the truth. They needed her more than she needed them. Because without her cooperation, their entire narrative collapsed. Without her as the hero, they became the villains. The hospital that failed, the administration that endangered patients, the institution that valued profit over protection. "I'll be in touch," Castellano said finally, voice tight with barely controlled fury. He left, his assistant scrambling to follow. Margaret returned to the window watching the media circus below and wondered if she'd just made the smartest decision of her life or the stupidest. Then her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She answered anyway. "Flynn." "Captain." Victor's voice was distorted, filtered through encryption software that made him sound mechanical. "That was quite a performance on the roof." Margaret's blood went cold. "How did you get this number?" "I've had it for 6 years. I've just been waiting for the right moment to use it." "What do you want?" "To congratulate you. You won tonight. You saved your operator, protected your hospital, even managed to avoid arrest. Very impressive." "Get to the point." "The point is that we both know this isn't over. You humiliated me, killed my people, cost me millions in assets and operations. And unlike you, I don't believe in forgiveness." Margaret's grip tightened on the phone. "Then come find me. Stop hiding behind phones and proxies and hired killers. Face me directly." Victor laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Oh, I will, but not yet. First, I'm going to take everything you care about, everyone who helped you tonight, that SEAL team, that FBI agent, that doctor who thinks you're a hero. One by one, they're going to disappear, and you're going to know it was your fault. You're bluffing. Am I? The line went dead. Margaret stood frozen, phone still pressed to her ear, Victor's words echoing in her mind. She'd won the battle. But the war was just beginning, and this time Victor wasn't interested in trafficking or profit or any of the things that had motivated him before. This time, it was personal. Margaret lowered the phone slowly, Victor's threat still ringing in her ears like tinnitus after an explosion. The conference room felt smaller suddenly, the walls closing in, every shadow a potential threat. She'd spent 16 years building invisibility as armor, and in one night she'd torn it all down. Now everyone she'd tried to protect was exposed. She pulled up her contacts and dialed Morrison's number. He answered on the first ring. Ma'am? Victor just called me. He's threatening your team, Agent Kwan, anyone who helped tonight. Silence on the other end, then Morrison's voice dropped to the tone he probably used when planning direct action raids. How credible is the threat? Completely. He doesn't bluff. If he says he's coming after you, he means it. Then we need to get ahead of this. I'll contact JSOC, get protective details assigned. That won't be enough. Victor doesn't work like conventional threats. He'll wait months if he has to, studying patterns, finding vulnerabilities, hitting when you've stopped watching. Morrison was quiet for a moment. So what do you suggest? Margaret looked out the window at the chaos below, police, FBI, media, all of them documenting what had happened here tonight, creating a record that couldn't be erased. An idea began forming, dangerous and probably insane, but with the kind of twisted logic that came from 15 years of asymmetric warfare. We use what he wants against him, she said. He called because he's angry, emotional. That makes him predictable. I'm listening. Victor thinks he controls the narrative, thinks he can operate in the shadows while we're stuck in the spotlight. So we flip it. We don't hide from the media, we use them. Make this story so public, so documented, that Victor can't move without exposing himself. You want to bait him into the open. I want to make him choose between revenge and survival, and Victor's ego won't let him walk away. Morrison exhaled slowly. That's risky. If it doesn't work, then we're no worse off than we are now. But if it does work, we end this tonight instead of spending the next 6 years looking over our shoulders. Another pause. Then, what do you need from me? Keep your team close, stay visible, and trust that I know what I'm doing. Always have, ma'am. Margaret ended the call and headed toward the elevator. Her reflection caught in the polished metal doors, blood-spattered clothes, hair coming loose from its bun, eyes that looked like they'd aged a decade in 6 hours. She looked exactly like what she was, someone who'd fought a war and survived. The question was whether anyone would believe her when she told them why. The hospital lobby was a controlled riot of activity. FBI agents interviewed staff in corners while police documented evidence and crime scene technicians photographed everything. Margaret spotted Agent Kwan near the reception desk, talking with her partner Torres while reviewing something on a tablet. Kwan looked up as Margaret approached, her expression shifting from professional neutrality to something that might have been concern. Captain Flynn, you should be resting. Victor called me 5 minutes ago, threatened to kill everyone who helped me tonight. Kwan's eyes sharpened. Did you record it? No, but I can tell you exactly what he said. Margaret recited the conversation verbatim, her memory for details still sharp despite the exhaustion. When she finished, Kwan was already typing notes into her tablet. We'll trace the number, but he's probably using burner phones and VPNs. Still, this is useful. Demonstrates ongoing criminal intent, which gives us leverage for warrants and surveillance. It also means you're a target now, Margaret said quietly. You, Torres, Morrison's team, Dr. Ramos, anyone Victor thinks cost him something tonight. Kwan's expression didn't change, but Margaret saw her hand drift toward her sidearm, an unconscious gesture born from threat assessment training. I've dealt with dangerous people before. Not like Victor. He doesn't send warnings. He doesn't make mistakes. When he moves, you won't see it coming. Then we'll have to see it coming anyway. Kwan gestured toward a quieter corner of the lobby. Walk with me. They moved away from the crowd, finding a space near the closed gift shop where the noise faded to background static. Kwan's face was illuminated by the glow from her tablet, casting shadows that made her look older than her years. I ran your background while you were upstairs, Quan said. The official one and the classified one. You had an impressive career, 15 years, multiple combat deployments, decorated for valor 3 times. Then 6 years ago, you just disappeared. Left the military, changed your name legally from Margaret Chen to Margaret Flynn, took a job at this hospital under credentials that were technically valid but significantly underplayed your qualifications. Margaret kept her expression neutral. People leave the military all the time. Not people like you, not decorated combat surgeons with clearances and connections. Usually when someone with your background disappears, it's because they're running from something. Quan paused. Or hiding from someone. Victor, I figured. What happened 6 years ago? Margaret was quiet for a long moment, weighing how much to share, how much truth was safe to expose. But she'd already decided to stop hiding, stop running. If she was going to survive this, she needed allies who understood exactly what they were facing. I was attached to a special operations task force in Afghanistan, she began. Our mission was counterterrorism, but we kept finding connections to trafficking networks, weapons, drugs, eventually people. Children, mostly, being moved through military supply channels by someone with access to our logistics systems. Quan's jaw tightened. Inside job. Worse. It was a network, contractors, interpreters, even a few military personnel who'd been compromised. Victor was running the operation from the civilian side, using his connections with local warlords and corrupt officials to move product while we provided security and transportation without knowing it. How did you figure it out? One of the kids escaped, made it to our FOB with cigarette burns on his arms, and a story about soldiers who looked like us. I started asking questions, found discrepancies in shipping manifests, unauthorized personnel accessing restricted areas, money transfers that didn't match operational budgets. Margaret's hands clenched. When I brought it to my commanding officer, I was told to drop it, that the investigation would be handled through proper channels. But you didn't drop it. I went to CID, then to NCIS, then to anyone who would listen. And someone in that chain of command warned Victor. He disappeared, took his network underground, and put a price on my head that's probably still active. Quan absorbed this, her expression unreadable. So you left the military, changed your identity, and spent 6 years hiding in plain sight. I thought if I disappeared, if I stopped being a threat, Victor would move on, find other targets, other enemies. Margaret's voice went quiet. I was wrong. Some people don't forget. They just wait. And now he's back because you exposed yourself saving Morrison's operator. Yes. Quan was silent for a moment, processing. Then she surprised Margaret by smiling, not with humor, but with the grim satisfaction of someone who'd just found the piece that made the puzzle make sense. Good, Quan said. Good? You just gave me probable cause to open a federal investigation into Victor's entire network. Human trafficking, corruption of military personnel, conspiracy to commit murder. We can freeze his assets, issue warrants, coordinate with international partners. Quan's smile widened. You've been running from him for 6 years. Now we're going to hunt him. Margaret felt something shift in her chest. Hope, maybe, or just the relief of not fighting alone anymore. He's not easy to find. Neither were you, apparently. But Morrison's team found you when they needed to. That's different. They knew where to look. So do we now. Quan pulled up something on her tablet and turned it toward Margaret. Your phone call with Victor. We traced it. Bounced through 17 countries before terminating at a cellular tower in Crestview Falls. Specifically, within a 2-mile radius of this hospital. Margaret's blood went cold. He's still here. He never left. He's watching. Waiting. Probably trying to figure out his next move now that his initial plan failed. Or setting up his next attack. That too. Quan lowered the tablet. Which is why I need you to do something that's going to feel wrong but is tactically necessary. What? I need you to go public, full media availability. Tell your story to every camera, every reporter, every news outlet that will listen. Make yourself the most visible target possible. Margaret stared at her. You want me to paint a target on my back. I want you to be the bait that draws Victor into the open. Right now he's got the advantage. He knows where you are, but we don't know where he is. If we make you visible enough, public enough, he'll have to move. And when he does, we'll be ready. And if you're not ready enough? Kwan's expression hardened. Then I'll make sure the person who kills him spells his name right in the report. Margaret almost smiled at that. Almost. All right, she said. Let's do this. 30 minutes later, Margaret stood in the hospital's main conference room facing a wall of cameras and reporters who looked like they'd been waiting their entire careers for a story this good. Agent Kwan stood to her left, Torres to her right, while Morrison and his team flanked the exits, protection masquerading as security. Dr. Carlyle had tried to attend but been politely escorted out by FBI agents. His protests had echoed down the hallway until someone closed a door. Margaret had changed into clean scrubs that the hospital provided, dark blue instead of her usual gray, the color reserved for senior staff she'd never been offered before. Someone had also given her coffee, which she held like a talisman against exhaustion. Kwan stepped to the microphone first. Thank you all for your patience. I'm Special Agent Rachel Kwan, FBI. At approximately 11:47 p.m. tonight, Lakewood General Hospital was attacked by an armed group with apparent connections to international criminal organizations. Thanks to the actions of hospital staff and military personnel, the attack was repelled with no civilian casualties. I'm going to turn this over to Captain Margaret Flynn, who played a crucial role in tonight's events. Margaret stepped forward, and the camera flashes increased, a strobe effect that would have been disorienting if she hadn't spent years being shot at. At least cameras couldn't kill you, usually. My name is Margaret Flynn, she said, her voice steady despite her nerves. For the past 16 years, I've worked as a night nurse at this hospital. Before that, I spent 15 years as a combat surgeon in the United States Army, attached to Special Operations Forces in Iraq and Afghanistan. She paused, letting that sink in, saw the reporter's expression shift from skeptical to interested. 6 years ago, I uncovered evidence of a human trafficking network operating through military channels. When I reported it, the people running that network decided I was a threat. I left the military, changed my identity, and tried to disappear. Another pause. The room was completely silent now, except for the click of camera shutters. Tonight, that network found me. They came to this hospital to kill a wounded soldier and anyone who tried to stop them. I chose to fight back. Using skills I learned in combat zones, I defended this hospital and the people inside it. 12 attackers are dead because of my actions. I don't regret that. I'd do it again. She could see the reporters calculating headlines, crafting narratives, deciding how to frame this. Hero or vigilante? Victim or aggressor? The story could go either way. Margaret decided to choose for them. The man who runs this network is named Viktor Antonov. He's Serbian, ex-military, and responsible for trafficking hundreds of children through conflict zones over the past decade. He called me 20 minutes ago and threatened to kill everyone who helped me tonight, including federal agents, military personnel, and hospital staff who were just doing their jobs. Now the reporters were leaning forward, hungry. So I'm making him an offer, Margaret continued. Victor, if you're watching this, and I know you are, here's the deal. Come after me. Not Morrison's team, not Agent Kwan, not Dr. Ramos or anyone else. Just me. You want revenge? I'm standing right here, in front of cameras, in front of witnesses, completely exposed. Kwan shifted slightly beside her. This wasn't part of the plan they'd discussed, but she didn't interrupt. But understand this, Margaret said, her voice hardening. I'm not running anymore. I'm not hiding. You come for me. You better bring everything you have, because I survived 15 years in combat zones, and I survived tonight, and I will survive you. She stepped back from the microphone. The reporters erupted with questions, but Kwan shut them down with a gesture and ended the press conference. Within minutes, the footage would be on every news network, every social media platform, every device in the world. Victor would see it, and he would come. The question was whether they'd be ready when he did. Margaret was escorted back to a private room on the 4th floor, technically for her protection, but it felt more like house arrest. Morrison's team maintained a perimeter while FBI agents monitored access points. She was probably the most guarded person in Crestview Falls. She was also completely alone. Dr. Ramos visited around 3 a.m., still in surgical scrubs, exhaustion written across every line of her face. "Hawk's stable," she said without preamble. "The vascular repair is holding. If he makes it through the next 6 hours without complications, he'll probably survive." "That's good news." "It is." Ramos sat in the chair beside Margaret's bed, studying her with an expression that was hard to read. "I've worked with you for 3 years. How did I not know?" "Because I didn't want you to know. Easier to be invisible when people underestimate you." "I never underestimated you." "Didn't you?" Margaret kept her voice gentle, not accusing. "You saw a middle-aged nurse who was quiet and competent but unremarkable. You never asked where I trained, what I'd done before, why someone with my skills was working night shifts for half the pay I could earn elsewhere." Ramos looked away, uncomfortable. "I should have noticed." "You weren't supposed to. That was the point." They sat in silence for a moment. The only sound, the muted beeping of medical equipment from somewhere down the hall. "What happens now?" Ramos asked finally. "Now we wait for Victor to make his move, and hope we survive it." "That's not much of a plan." "It's the only plan we've got." Ramos stood to leave, paused at the door. "For what it's worth, what you did tonight. That took courage. Not everyone would have fought. Most people would have run." "I ran for 6 years. Didn't help." "Maybe. But you're not running now. That has to count for something." After Ramos left, Margaret tried to sleep, but her mind wouldn't quiet. She kept replaying the night's events, analyzing decisions, calculating alternatives. What if she'd evacuated instead of fighting? What if she'd let Morrison's team handle it? What if she'd stayed invisible? But those were questions without answers, roads not taken, choices unmade. Around 4 a.m., her phone buzzed. Unknown number again. She answered. "Victor?" That was quite a speech. His voice sounded different this time, less filtered, more genuine, almost impressed. "You're trying to bait me into attacking. Is it working?" He laughed, a real laugh this time, not the mechanical sound from before. "You know what I respect about you, Flynn? You don't pretend. Most people in your position would be negotiating, begging, trying to find compromise. But you're just ready to fight. What else is there?" "Smart question. Unfortunately, I can't give you what you want. Not tonight." Margaret's grip tightened on the phone. "Meaning what?" "Meaning I'm leaving Crestview Falls, leaving the country, actually. Your little press conference made things too complicated. Too much attention, too much heat. You're running." "I'm being strategic. There's a difference." His voice hardened. "But don't mistake this for surrender. I meant what I said. Everyone who helped you tonight is going to pay. Just not immediately. I'm patient. I can wait months, years if necessary." "Then you'll be waiting a long time." "We'll see. Goodbye, Captain Flynn. I'll be in touch." The line went dead. Margaret sat in the darkness, phone still in her hand, trying to decide if Victor was bluffing or telling the truth, if he really was leaving or if this was misdirection. Then her door burst open and Morrison rushed in, weapon drawn, face grim. "We've got a problem," he said. "Hospital security just found explosive devices in 3 locations: generator room, oxygen storage, and the administrative wing. They're on timers. We've got maybe 10 minutes before this entire building goes up." Margaret was on her feet instantly. "Evacuate everyone now." "Already in progress, but we can't clear the building in time. Too many patients who can't be moved." "Then we disable the bombs." Morrison shook his head. "Bomb squad is 20 minutes out. We don't have the time or the expertise." "I do." He stared at her. "Ma'am?" "Part of combat medical training includes explosive ordnance familiarization. We had to know how to identify and disable IEDs in case wounded operators were booby-trapped." Margaret was already moving toward the door. "Where's the nearest device?" "Generator room, basement level." "Show me." They ran through corridors filled with evacuating patients and staff, Morrison clearing a path while Margaret's mind raced through everything she remembered about explosive devices. The training had been years ago, but some skills never faded. The generator room was exactly where Margaret remembered, a concrete bunker in the hospital's deepest level, filled with industrial machinery and the thrumming sound of diesel engines. The bomb was easy to spot. A military-grade explosive pack attached to the main fuel line, timer counting down with digital precision. 7 minutes, 32 seconds. Margaret knelt beside it, examining the construction. Professional work, military-grade materials, multiple redundancies to prevent tampering, Victor's signature style. "Can you disable it?" Morrison asked. "Maybe, if I can access the timing mechanism without triggering anti-tamper switches. And if you can't, then we're both going to get very intimate with the ceiling." Margaret pulled out a multi-tool from Morrison's vest and began working. The bomb's casing was held by 6 screws, each one potentially wired to trigger detonation. She tested the first screw with a non-conductive probe, watching for electrical continuity. Nothing. She unscrewed it carefully and moved to the next. 5 minutes remained. Morrison stood guard at the door, weapon ready, trusting her to work. The confidence was both reassuring and terrifying. The second screw was clean. Third screw, also clean. Fourth screw triggered a continuity alarm. Margaret froze, sweat dripping down her back despite the cool air. The alarm meant this screw was part of a circuit. Removing it would complete the circuit and detonate the bomb immediately. 4 minutes. She traced the wire with her eyes, following it from the screw to a junction box, then to what looked like a dummy component, something designed to mimic an essential part, but actually serving no purpose except to confuse disposal efforts. Classic misdirection. Margaret bypassed the 4th screw entirely and moved to the 5th. Clean. 6th, also clean. 3 minutes. With 5 screws removed, she could now pry the casing open enough to see the internal mechanism. The timer was connected to a detonator, which was connected to the explosive pack through a series of wires. 3 red, 2 blue, 1 black. Standard configuration would be red wires for power, blue for ground, black for signal. But Victor never did anything standard. 2 minutes. Margaret pulled out her phone and snapped photos of the device, sending them to a contact she hadn't called in 6 years, a former EOD specialist who'd taught her the basics during deployment. The response came back in seconds. "Black wire is dummy. Cut blue first, then red second from left. Don't touch anything else." Margaret took a breath, steadied her hands, and cut the first blue wire. The timer kept counting. 1 minute, 30 seconds. She cut the second blue wire. Still counting. 1 minute. The second red wire from the left was tucked behind the detonator, barely accessible. She had to work the cutting edge of her tool into a gap barely wider than the wire itself. 30 seconds. The wire gave resistance, the coating thick and military grade. 20 seconds. Margaret put everything she had into the cut, feeling the wire start to separate strand by strand. 10 seconds. 9. 8. The wire snapped. The timer stopped at 004. Margaret sat back, breathing hard, hands shaking with adrenaline dump. Morrison's voice was calm. 1 down, 2 to go. They repeated the process 2 more times, oxygen storage with 3 minutes to spare, administrative wing with 90 seconds. Each bomb was identical in construction, which meant Victor had assembled them personally. He didn't trust this kind of work to subordinates, which also meant he'd been in the hospital recently, probably while Margaret was giving her press conference. By the time they finished, dawn was breaking over Crestview Falls. The evacuation had been successful. Every patient relocated to other facilities or secure areas. Every staff member accounted for. 0 casualties from Victor's final attack. Margaret stood in the hospital parking lot, watching the sun rise over buildings that should have been rubble, surrounded by people who should have been dead. Agent Kwan approached from the direction of a FBI mobile command unit. "We found Victor's entry point," she said. "Service entrance, camera footage deleted, but we recovered fragments from a hard drive. He was in the hospital for 40 minutes, planning devices, probably hoping you'd be killed in the explosion or blamed for it. Instead, he failed. Again. Which makes him desperate. Desperate people make mistakes." Kwan handed Margaret a tablet showing thermal satellite imagery. "We tracked his vehicle leaving the city 2 hours ago, heading north toward the Canadian border. Border Patrol has been alerted. We'll have him in custody by noon." Margaret studied the imagery, looking for something that felt wrong. Victor was too smart to run in a straight line, too experienced to think he could cross borders without being tracked. Unless he wanted to be tracked, unless this was one more misdirection. "Pull up the footage from the service entrance," Margaret said. "The actual footage, not just the timestamps." Quan complied, pulling up recovered video on the tablet. It showed a figure in maintenance coveralls entering the hospital, moving with purpose but not urgency. The figure's face was obscured by a cap and surgical mask. "Zoom in on the hands," Margaret said. Quan enhanced the image. The figure's hands were visible for just a moment, scarred, rough, clearly masculine. But Victor's hands had been smooth when Margaret saw him on the roof. No scars, no calluses. "That's not Victor," Margaret said quietly. "What?" "The person who planted those bombs, that's not Victor. He sent someone else." Quan's expression shifted from confident to alarmed. "Then where is he?" Margaret's phone buzzed. She answered without checking the number, already knowing who it would be. "Hello again, Captain." Victor's voice was warm, almost friendly. "I assume you figured out my little deception by now. The bombs were never meant to kill anyone, just keep us busy while you did something else." "Very good. I'm impressed." "What did you do, Victor?" "I took something that belongs to you, or rather, someone." Margaret's blood went cold. "Who?" "Dr. Elena Ramos. She's currently sedated in the back of a van, heading somewhere you'll never find her, unless, of course, you're willing to trade." The world seemed to tilt. "What do you want?" "You, alone, unarmed, in exchange for her life. You have 1 hour to decide." The line went dead. Margaret stood frozen, the tablet still in her hand showing thermal imagery of a decoy vehicle, while the real Victor was somewhere in Crestview Falls with a hostage. With her friend. Quan was already mobilizing resources, calling in tactical teams, coordinating with local police. But Margaret knew it wouldn't matter. Victor had planned this perfectly. He'd studied her for 6 years, learned what mattered, found the exact pressure point that would make her abandon strategy for emotion, and it was working. Morrison appeared at her side. "Ma'am, we'll find her. We have resources, technology." "We have 1 hour," Margaret interrupted. "He'll kill her if we don't meet his demands." "Then we meet them, but on our terms." Margaret looked at him, at Quan, at the assembled law enforcement and military personnel who were ready to fight, ready to follow her lead. And she made the only decision she could. "No," she said. "I'm going alone." Morrison's objection came immediately. "Ma'am, that's suicide. Victor will kill you the moment he has you." "Probably," Margaret said, her voice calm despite the fear clawing at her chest. "But he'll kill Dr. Ramos for certain if I don't show. At least this way one of us has a chance." Quan stepped forward, her FBI training warring with something that looked like genuine concern. "Captain Flynn, we can't authorize this. The moment you walk into that situation alone, you lose every tactical advantage." "I don't need tactical advantages. I need time." "Time for what?" Margaret turned to Morrison, ignoring Quan's question. "Your team. How fast can they mobilize for a rescue operation?" Morrison's eyes narrowed, understanding dawning. "Depends on the location. If we have solid intelligence, we can be wheels up in 10 minutes. Then I'll get you that intelligence, but I need you to trust me. Can you do that?" Morrison studied her for a long moment, then nodded once. Sharp, final. "What do you need?" "A tracker. Something small enough that Victor won't find it in a standard search, and a comm unit that can transmit even if I'm unconscious." "Done." Morrison was already moving, speaking into his radio, coordinating with his team. Quan grabbed Margaret's arm. "This is insane. You're talking about walking into a trap with nothing but hope and a tracking device." "No," Margaret said quietly. "I'm talking about giving Victor exactly what he wants while making him think he's won. It's called misdirection. He taught me that 6 years ago." She pulled free and headed toward the mobile command unit where Morrison's team was assembling gear. Behind her, Quan was already coordinating with tactical units, positioning assets, preparing for every contingency. But Margaret knew the truth. No amount of preparation would matter if Victor decided she wasn't worth keeping alive. 15 minutes later, Margaret stood in the command unit while a communications specialist attached a microtransmitter to the inside of her collar, so small it looked like a loose thread, so sophisticated it could broadcast her location and audio within a 5-mile radius. "It's passive," the specialist explained, his hands steady despite the time pressure. "Won't show up on RF sweeps, won't trigger metal detectors. But if someone physically finds it and knows what they're looking for, it's compromised. Understood. Morrison handed her a second device, a flat piece of polymer the size of a credit card, designed to slip into the sole of her shoe. Backup tracker. Different frequency, different signature. Even if he finds the first one, this should stay hidden. Margaret accepted it with a nod, working the card into her left sneaker where the orthotic insert created a natural pocket. The fit was tight, but not uncomfortable. "One more thing," Morrison said, and handed her something that made her breath catch. A scalpel. Surgical grade, razor sharp, barely longer than her palm. "It's ceramic," he said. "Won't show up on any scanner. Keep it somewhere accessible but not obvious." Margaret slipped it into the waistband of her scrub pants, the familiar weight of a blade settling against her hip like an old friend. She'd carried scalpels into combat zones for 15 years, sometimes to save lives, occasionally to take them. Tonight might require both. Her phone buzzed. Text message from an unknown number containing only GPS coordinates and a time. 6:47 a.m. 43 minutes from now. Margaret pulled up the coordinates on a map. An abandoned industrial complex on the outskirts of Crestview Falls. Old textile mills that had been shuttered for decades, surrounded by overgrown lots and forgotten infrastructure. Perfect location for an ambush. Multiple entry points, lots of cover, easy to defend and harder to assault. Victor had chosen well. "That's our target," Margaret said, showing Morrison the coordinates. "Your team will need to stage at least a mile out. Any closer, and he'll see you coming." Morrison was already plotting approach vectors on a tablet. "We can use the old rail yard as a staging point. Gives us clear sight lines and multiple ingress routes. But ma'am, if this goes wrong, you put 2 rounds in Victor's head and make sure Dr. Ramos gets home safe. That's the mission. Everything else is secondary." "Including you?" "Especially me." Morrison looked like he wanted to argue, but military discipline held. "Yes, ma'am." Margaret checked the time. 38 minutes. She walked to the edge of the parking lot where Agent Kwan was coordinating with local police, trying to establish perimeters without alerting Victor's surveillance. "I'm going in alone," Margaret said. "No backup visible, no drones, no snipers. If Victor even suspects a setup, he'll kill Dr. Ramos before you can breach." Kwan's jaw tightened. "And if he kills you both anyway?" "Then at least I tried." Margaret pulled out a small notepad and scribbled something quickly. "This is everything I know about Victor's network. Contacts, safe houses, financial channels. If I don't make it out, use this to burn what's left of his operation." Kwan took the notepad, her expression unreadable. "You know this is probably a one-way trip." "I've taken worse odds." "When?" Margaret smiled without humor. "Every day for the last 6 years." She turned and walked toward the vehicle Morrison had prepared. An unmarked sedan, no tactical equipment, nothing that would suggest military involvement, just a tired surgeon driving to her own execution. The drive to the industrial complex took 20 minutes through streets still mostly empty in the pre-dawn darkness. Margaret kept her speed exactly at the limit, followed every traffic law, gave Victor no reason to suspect she was anything but compliant. The transmitter against her collar felt like a lifeline. The scalpel against her hip felt like a promise. She arrived at the coordinates with 3 minutes to spare. The industrial complex loomed ahead, 3 massive brick buildings connected by rusted catwalks and broken windows, surrounded by chain-link fence topped with ancient barbed wire. A single gate stood open, obviously intentional. Margaret parked the sedan and stepped out into the cold morning air. Dawn was breaking in earnest now, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that seemed too beautiful for what was about to happen. She walked through the gate, hands visible, moving slowly enough to be non-threatening. The ground was littered with broken glass and industrial debris, every step crunching loud enough to announce her presence. "I'm here, Victor," she called out. "Alone. Unarmed. Just like you wanted." Silence answered her. Margaret continued forward, approaching the nearest building. The door hung open, darkness beyond. Every instinct screamed at her to turn around, to run, to do anything except walk into that obvious trap. She went inside anyway. The interior was a cathedral of decay, massive space filled with rusted machinery and collapsed ceiling sections, light filtering through broken windows and dusty shafts. And in the center, illuminated by a single work light, Dr. Elena Ramos sat bound to a chair. She was alive, conscious, terrified. Margaret started toward her, then stopped when Victor's voice echoed from somewhere in the shadows. "That's far enough, Captain." He emerged from behind a pillar, flanked by two armed men Margaret didn't recognize. Victor looked different in daylight, older, harder, the scar on his neck more prominent. But his eyes held the same cold intelligence she remembered. "Doctor." "Ramos?" Margaret said, keeping her voice steady. "Are you hurt?" Elena shook her head, the gag in her mouth preventing speech. Her eyes were red from crying, but focused, aware. "She's fine," Victor said. "For now. Whether she stays that way depends entirely on your cooperation." "I'm here." "That was the deal." "The deal was you come alone and unarmed. Let's verify that, shall we?" He gestured to one of his men who approached Margaret with a handheld metal detector. Margaret raised her arms, allowing the search. The detector passed over her body without reaction, the ceramic scalpel invisible, the polymer tracker undetectable. The man patted her down roughly, but found nothing except the phone in her pocket, which he removed and crushed under his boot. "Clean," he reported to Victor. Victor smiled. "Excellent. You see, Captain, this is so much simpler when everyone follows the rules. You wanted me. You have me. Let Dr. Ramos go. In time, first we're going to have a conversation about consequences, about the price of interfering in things that don't concern you." He walked closer, studying her face like a surgeon examining a particularly interesting wound. 6 years I've been planning this. 6 years of watching you pretend to be someone you're not. Did you really think you could hide forever? I thought I could avoid killing you. Turns out I was wrong." Victor laughed, genuine amusement mixed with something darker. "Even now, tied to nothing, surrounded by armed men, you're still making threats. That's what I always admired about you, Flynn. You never learned when to quit." "Funny. I was about to say the same thing about you." His expression hardened. "You cost me everything. My network, my reputation, millions in revenue. Children I could have sold, weapons I could have moved, all gone because you decided to play hero. Those were human beings, Victor, not commodities. To you, maybe. To me, they were product, supply and demand, economics." He shrugged. "But you wouldn't understand that. You Americans with your morality and your rules, you think you're better than people like me. I don't think I'm better. I know I'm better. Because when I had the chance to profit from suffering, I chose to stop it instead." Victor's hand moved faster than Margaret expected, striking her across the face with enough force to snap her head sideways. She tasted blood, felt her vision blur, but stayed on her feet. "You chose to destroy what I built," he said quietly. "And now I'm going to destroy what you care about, starting with her." He pulled a pistol from his belt and pointed it at Elena, who made a muffled sound behind her gag. Margaret's mind raced. The transmitter was broadcasting, which meant Morrison's team knew exactly where she was. But they were still minutes out, and minutes might as well be hours if Victor decided to pull that trigger now. She needed to buy time. "You're making a mistake," Margaret said. "Am I?" "Killing her accomplishes nothing. She's not a threat to you. She's just a doctor who happened to be in the wrong place. She helped you. That makes her a threat. She didn't know what she was helping with. Ask her yourself. She thought she was just saving a wounded soldier. She had no idea about your network, your operations, your connections." Victor's gun didn't waver. "And yet she still helped you, which means she chose a side. And people who choose the wrong side pay the price." "Then make me pay it instead." Margaret stepped forward, hands still raised. "You want revenge? Take it out on me. I'm the one who burned your network. I'm the one who exposed you. I'm the one who's been running from you for 6 years. You think I won't kill both of you? I think you're smarter than that. Killing me sends a message that Margaret Flynn finally paid for her sins. Killing a random doctor just makes you look desperate." Victor considered this. The gun still pointed at Elena. Margaret could see him calculating, weighing options, trying to decide which choice served his purposes better. Finally, he lowered the weapon. "You're right," he said. "Killing her would be wasteful, but I can't just let her go. She's seen too much, knows too much. So what do you want? I want you to watch while I take everything you fought for and turn it into nothing. Victor gestured to one of his men, who pulled out a tablet and turned it toward Margaret. The screen showed live footage from inside Lakewood General Hospital. Staff moving through corridors, patients in rooms, everything normal, except for the blinking red indicators on the blueprint overlay. I have operatives inside your hospital, Victor said. 6 of them, positioned in critical locations. ICU, surgical wing, pediatrics, each one carrying enough explosives to level their respective floors. Margaret's blood went cold. You're bluffing. Am I? Victor tapped the tablet, and one of the indicators changed color. Seconds later, Margaret heard a distant boom echo across the city. Not the hospital. Somewhere else. A demonstration. That was an abandoned building 3 blocks from Lakewood General, Victor said. The next one will be the pediatric ward. Unless you give me something I want. What? Names. Every contact you have in military intelligence, law enforcement, government oversight. Everyone who helped you destroy my network. You give me that, and I'll call off the attack. Margaret's mind raced. If she gave him those names, she'd be signing death warrants for dozens of people who trusted her. But if she didn't, children would die. The mathematics of morality, calculated in lives. She was trying to decide which choice she could live with when the building's exterior door crashed open and Morrison's voice echoed through the space. Federal agents, drop your weapons. Victor's expression went from confident to furious in an instant. He grabbed Margaret, pressing the gun against her temple. I should have known you wouldn't come alone. I did come alone, Margaret said. They followed me. There's a difference. Not one that matters. Morrison and his team poured through multiple entrances, weapons trained, moving with the coordinated precision of operators who'd done this 1,000 times. Agent Kwan was with them, along with what looked like half the FBI's tactical response unit. Victor was surrounded, outgunned, and out of options, but he still had the gun against Margaret's head. Everyone stops or she dies, Victor shouted. Morrison held up a hand, halting his team. Mr. Antonoff, there's no way out of this. Lower your weapon and we can I said stop. Victor pressed the gun harder against Margaret's skull. I'm walking out of here with her, and if anyone tries to stop me, I'll paint these walls with her brain. Margaret could feel Victor's heartbeat through the barrel pressed against her temple. Rapid, erratic, the rhythm of a man realizing he'd lost. Desperate people made mistakes. She just had to give him the opportunity. Victor, she said quietly, keeping her voice calm. Look around. You're surrounded by special operations soldiers and federal agents. Your men are outgunned. Your escape routes are blocked. Your operatives in the hospital are already being detained. Agent Kwan's team moved in the moment you showed that tablet. Victor went rigid. You're lying. Am I? Margaret nodded toward Kwan, who held up her own tablet showing footage of FBI agents arresting Victor's people inside Lakewood General. It's over. The only question now is whether you want to go to prison or die here. For a long moment, Victor didn't move. Then Margaret felt his grip on her shift. Just slightly, the gun barrel moving a fraction of an inch away from her temple. It was the opening she needed. Margaret drove her elbow backward into Victor's solar plexus, simultaneously dropping her weight and twisting away from the gun. The movement was pure muscle memory from hand-to-hand combat training, practiced so many times it happened without thought. Victor's gun discharged, the round passing inches from Margaret's ear and burying itself in a wall. She continued her spin, pulling the ceramic scalpel from her waistband and slashing across Victor's gun hand. He screamed and dropped the weapon, blood streaming from the deep cut across his knuckles. Margaret kicked the gun away and stepped back as Morrison's team rushed forward, tackling Victor to the ground, zip-tying his hands, securing him with the kind of efficiency that came from extensive practice. It was over in less than 5 seconds. Margaret stood breathing hard, the scalpel still in her hand, Victor's blood dripping from the blade. Around her, the tactical team was securing the building, checking for additional threats, calling for medical support. She walked to where Elena sat bound to the chair and carefully cut through the restraints, removing the gag with gentle hands. Elena gasped for breath, tears streaming down her face. Margaret, I thought I was so scared. I know. It's okay. You're safe now. Elena threw her arms around Margaret, sobbing into her shoulder. Margaret held her, making soothing sounds, keeping her own hand steady despite the adrenaline still coursing through her system. Over Elena's shoulder, she saw Morrison approach Victor, who was now on his knees, hands bound, blood dripping from his injured hand. Victor Antonov, Morrison said formally, you're under arrest for human trafficking, attempted murder, terrorism, and about 40 other charges I'm probably forgetting. You have the right to remain silent. Save it, Victor spat. He turned his head to look at Margaret, his expression a mixture of rage and something that might have been respect. You won, Flynn. Congratulations. But this isn't the end. My network is bigger than you know. My people are everywhere. You might have stopped me, but you haven't stopped what I built. Margaret walked over to him, still holding the bloody scalpel, and knelt so they were eye to eye. You're right, she said quietly. I haven't stopped your entire network, but I stopped you. And tomorrow, I'll wake up and stop someone else. And the day after that, someone else. Because unlike you, I don't need to win completely. I just need to keep fighting. She stood and handed the scalpel to an evidence technician, watching as Victor was hauled to his feet and escorted out of the building. Agent Kwan approached, exhaustion and relief warring on her face. That was either the bravest thing I've ever seen or the stupidest. I haven't decided which. Can it be both? Kwan almost smiled. We detained all 6 of Victor's people in the hospital. The explosives were real, but our bomb squad disabled them without incident. 0 casualties. And Victor's network? We're freezing assets, issuing warrants, coordinating with international partners. It'll take months to fully dismantle everything he built, but we're already making progress. Thanks to the information you provided. Margaret nodded, feeling the weight of 16 years of hiding finally start to lift from her shoulders. What happens now? Now you give a statement, we process the scene, and you probably become the most famous person in Crestview Falls. Kwan paused. The media is already calling you a hero. I'm not a hero. I'm just someone who did what needed doing. That's what heroes say. 3 days later, Margaret stood in the conference room at Lakewood General Hospital, facing an assembly of people who'd spent 16 years barely noticing she existed. The hospital's board of directors sat at the long table, flanked by administrators, legal counsel, and Dr. Carlisle, who looked like he'd aged a decade in 72 hours. The board chairman, a silver-haired woman named Patricia Aldrich, gestured to an empty chair. Please, Captain Flynn, sit. Margaret remained standing. I'm fine here. Aldrich's lips twitched in what might have been amusement. As you wish. We asked you here today to discuss your future at this hospital. I assumed you'd be terminating my employment, given the circumstances. On the contrary, we'd like to offer you a position, Director of Trauma Services, as previously suggested by our legal team, full salary, benefits, complete departmental autonomy. Margaret stared at her. You're offering me a promotion after I turned your hospital into a war zone. You saved this hospital from becoming a war zone, Aldrich corrected. The board has reviewed the incident thoroughly. Your actions, while unorthodox, prevented what could have been a catastrophic loss of life. We'd be foolish not to recognize that. Dr. Carlisle shifted uncomfortably in his seat but said nothing. What about Dr. Carlisle's concerns? Margaret asked. His recommendations that I retire? His assessment that I was too old, too slow, too unreliable? Aldrich's expression went cold as she turned to Carlisle. Dr. Carlisle has submitted his resignation, effective immediately. The board has accepted it. Carlisle's face went white. What? You can't. We can, and we have. Your handling of this crisis was inadequate at best and actively obstructive at worst. You attempted to fire a decorated combat surgeon hours before she saved dozens of lives. You prioritized bureaucracy over patient safety, and you tried to prosecute a hero to cover your own inadequacies. Aldrich's voice was steel wrapped in silk. Your resignation spares you the embarrassment of termination. Carlisle stood, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. This is outrageous. I've given this hospital 9 months of exemplary service, 9 months of ego and incompetence, Margaret said quietly. You're a competent physician, Carlisle. But you're a terrible leader. You confused authority with expertise and treated people as disposable. That's not medicine. That's just cruelty with a medical degree. Carlyle glared at her, opened his mouth to respond, then seemed to think better of it. He grabbed his briefcase and stormed out, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the frame. Aldrich turned back to Margaret. So, Director of Trauma Services, are you interested? Margaret thought about it. About the years of hiding, of making herself small, of accepting less than she deserved because it felt safer than standing tall. No, she said. The room went silent. No? Aldrich repeated. I appreciate the offer, but I've accepted a position elsewhere. The Department of Defense has reinstated my commission. I'll be teaching combat medicine at Walter Reed, training the next generation of field surgeons, starting next month. Understanding dawned on Aldrich's face. Back to active duty. Back to where I belong. Aldrich stood and extended her hand. Then on behalf of the board, thank you for your service, both to this hospital and to our country. We're honored to have had you on our staff, even if we didn't fully appreciate it at the time. Margaret shook her hand, feeling the last piece of her old life fall away. She left the hospital that afternoon for the last time, walking through corridors she'd haunted for 16 years like a ghost. Staff stopped to watch her pass, not with dismissal now, but with recognition. Some nodded, a few saluted. One young nurse who'd worked with Margaret on countless night shifts stepped forward. Captain Flynn, I just wanted to say thank you for everything you taught me. Even when you were pretending to be just a nurse, you were the best teacher I ever had. Margaret smiled. I was never pretending to be just a nurse. Nursing is one of the most important jobs in medicine. Don't let anyone tell you different. The young nurse nodded, eyes bright with tears. Margaret walked out the front entrance into afternoon sunlight that felt warmer than it had any right to. Morrison was waiting by a black SUV, wearing dress uniform, looking every inch the professional operator. Ma'am, he said, straightening to attention, your transport to Washington is ready. At ease, Morrison, we're not in the field. He relaxed slightly. How did it go? They offered me a job. I turned them down. Good, because Hawk wanted me to give you this. He handed her an envelope. Margaret opened it. Inside was a handwritten note on hospital stationery. Captain Flynn. They tell me I have a 90% chance of full recovery. Doctor says it's because someone kept me alive long enough to get proper treatment. I'm told that someone was you. I don't remember much about that night, but I remember you telling me to stay with you, to keep fighting. That's what I did. Thank you for not giving up on me. When you get to Walter Reed, look me up. I owe you a beer, or 50. Hawk Margaret folded the note carefully and slipped it into her pocket. He's doing well, Morrison said. Full mobility expected. Should be back to operational status in 6 months. Good. The teams need people like him. They need people like you too, ma'am. The students you'll be teaching, they're going to save a lot of lives because of what you show them. Margaret looked back at the hospital one last time, at the building she'd protected, the staff she'd saved, the place where she'd spent 16 years hiding from herself. I'm done running, she said quietly. Yes, ma'am, I noticed. 2 weeks later, Margaret stood in a classroom at Walter Reed Medical Center, facing 30 medical students who looked impossibly young and eager. Her uniform was crisp, her rank insignia newly polished, her credentials displayed on the wall behind her in frames that caught the afternoon light. Major Margaret Flynn, 8th Special Operations Medical Group, combat surgeon, instructor. Welcome to Advanced Trauma Medicine, she began. I'm Major Flynn. Over the next 16 weeks, I'm going to teach you how to keep people alive in situations where every instinct says they should be dead, how to perform surgery with minimal equipment in maximum chaos, how to make decisions when there's no time and lives hang in the balance. She paused, studying their faces. Some of you are here because you want to serve, some because you want prestige, some because you think combat medicine sounds exciting. Let me be clear, this course will challenge everything you think you know about medicine. It will push you past your limits. It will force you to confront situations that will haunt you for the rest of your careers. A hand went up in the back. Young man, barely 25, nervous but determined. Yes? Ma'am, is it true you performed surgery during a firefight 2 weeks ago? Margaret smiled slightly. I performed surgery during what became a firefight. There's a difference. Anyone can work in ideal conditions. This course teaches you to work when conditions are anything but ideal. Another hand. Young woman, sharp eyes, the kind of focus that suggested prior military experience. What's the most important skill for a combat surgeon? Margaret thought about Kandahar, about Lakewood General, about 16 years of fighting and hiding and finally choosing to stand. Adaptability, she said. The ability to assess a situation, make a decision, and execute without hesitation. Plans fail, equipment breaks, people panic. But if you can adapt, if you can take what you have and make it enough, you can save lives that everyone else would write off as lost. She moved to the front of the classroom, her presence commanding attention without demanding it. You're going to learn procedures, protocols, techniques, but more importantly, you're going to learn to trust yourself. To know that when everything goes wrong and you're the only thing standing between a patient and death, you have what it takes to make a difference. The students were leaning forward now, hanging on every word. Over the next 16 weeks, I'm going to share everything I learned in 15 years of combat deployments. Every mistake, every success, every lesson purchased with blood and terror and desperate hope. And when you leave this classroom, you'll be ready for the worst day of your professional life. She paused, meeting each student's eyes in turn. Because that worst day is coming. And when it does, you're going to save someone who matters desperately to somebody. That's why we do this, not for glory, not for recognition, but because we're the ones who can. After class, Margaret walked through Walter Reed's corridors, passing nurses and doctors and patients in various stages of recovery. The building hummed with the purposeful energy of healing, of people fighting to reclaim lives that injury or illness had tried to steal. She found Hawk in physical therapy, working through resistance exercises with the kind of grim determination that suggested he'd be back to operational status ahead of schedule. He looked up when she entered and broke into a genuine smile. "Captain Flynn, they told me you started teaching today." "Major Flynn now, and yes, first day. How'd it go?" "Ask me again in 16 weeks when we see if any of them make it through." Hawk laughed, then winced as the movement pulled at still healing tissue. "Fair enough. Listen, I wanted to thank you properly. What you did that night, you already thanked me in the note. The note was nice, but I figured I owed you something more substantial." He gestured to a table beside his therapy equipment where 2 beers sat waiting, condensation beading on the bottles. "I know we're on a military installation, but I checked with the nurses. Said 1 beer wouldn't kill me." Margaret accepted a bottle, touched by the gesture. "To surviving impossible odds." "To the people who make survival possible," Hawk countered. They clinked bottles and drank, the beer cold and perfect after a long day. "They're saying you're going to revolutionize combat medical training," Hawk said after a moment. "That students who go through your program will save twice as many lives as conventional training produces. That's the goal. Whether we achieve it remains to be seen. You will, because you don't accept failure as an option." Well, Margaret thought about Victor, about Carlisle, about everyone who'd underestimated her over the years. "I accept failure all the time. I just don't accept giving up." "That's why you're going to be great at this." They talked for another hour, about recovery, about the future, about the strange ways life brought people together and pushed them apart. When Margaret finally left, the sun was setting over Washington, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. She walked to her quarters, a small but comfortable apartment on the Walter Reed campus, and found a package waiting at her door. No return address, just her name written in careful block letters. Inside was a framed photograph she hadn't seen in 6 years, her old combat medical unit posed in front of a field hospital in Kandahar. Younger faces, different lives, a moment frozen before everything changed, and tucked inside the frame was a note from Agent Kwan. "Major Flynn, thought you might want this back. We recovered it from a safe house during our raid on Victor's network. Turns out he'd been tracking you longer than we thought. But he's in federal custody now, awaiting trial. Multiple life sentences are expected. Your testimony was crucial. Thank you for your cooperation and your courage. Also, I've been authorized to inform you that 3 other trafficking networks have collapsed following Victor's arrest. Dozens of children have been recovered, and returned to their families. Your actions saved more lives than you'll ever know. If you're ever in the area, look me up. First beer is on me. Agent Rachel Kwan. Margaret set the photograph on her desk, positioning it where she'd see it every morning. A reminder of who she'd been, who she'd become, and who she still had the potential to be. Her phone buzzed, text from Morrison. News is reporting Victor's trial starts next month. They're calling it the biggest human trafficking prosecution in a decade. You planning to testify? Margaret typed back. Wouldn't miss it. Another text. Good. He should see your face when they lock him away. She smiled and set the phone down, looking around her new quarters. Smaller than her apartment in Crestview Falls had been, but somehow it felt larger, like there was room to breathe, room to grow, room to be exactly who she was without apology. 6 months later, Margaret stood in a federal courthouse watching Viktor Antonov receive 7 consecutive life sentences for crimes that the judge listed for nearly 20 minutes. He didn't look at her when the sentence was read, but she saw his shoulders slump, the final acknowledgement of defeat. Outside the courthouse, reporters crowded around Margaret, shouting questions about her role in bringing down the trafficking network, about her return to active duty, about what came next. She gave them a brief statement, thanking law enforcement, recognizing the survivors, acknowledging the work still to be done. Then she walked away, leaving the media circus behind, heading back to Walter Reed where her students were waiting. A year after that night at Lakewood General, Margaret received a letter from the hospital. Inside was a newspaper clipping showing the newly renovated trauma wing, expanded, modernized, equipped with state-of-the-art equipment. The dedication plaque read, "The Margaret Flynn Center for Trauma Excellence." In recognition of extraordinary courage and dedication to saving lives. She framed it and hung it beside the photograph from Kandahar. Her students graduated at rates higher than any previous class. They deployed to combat zones, disaster areas, civilian trauma centers, and they saved lives, hundreds of them, then thousands, using techniques and decision-making frameworks Margaret had taught them. Letters came back from the field, young surgeons writing to thank her, to share stories, to tell her about the patients who lived because of what she'd shown them. Margaret kept every letter. On the second anniversary of that night, Dr. Elena Ramos visited Washington. They met for dinner at a quiet restaurant near Walter Reed, 2 women who'd survived horror together and come out stronger on the other side. "You look good," Elena said. "Happy." "I am. Turns out I was never meant to hide." "None of us are, but it takes courage to stop." They talked about the hospital. Elena had been promoted to chief of surgery, was implementing protocols Margaret had suggested. They talked about their patients, their work, the strange ways trauma could transform people if they let it. "Do you ever think about that night?" Elena asked. "Every day, but not with fear anymore. With gratitude." Grateful for what? Margaret thought about it, searching for words that could encompass everything that night had cost and given her. Grateful that when it mattered I didn't run, that I stood up and fought for something worth protecting, that I remembered who I was supposed to be. Elena raised her glass. To remembering who we are, and to never forgetting again. 3 years later, Major Margaret Flynn was promoted to Lieutenant Colonel and given command of the entire combat medical training program at Walter Reed. Her methods became standard protocol across all military medical branches. Survival rates in combat zones increased by 43% over previous years. She never married, never had children, built a life around teaching and service and the quiet satisfaction of watching her students succeed. But she wasn't alone. Morrison stayed in touch, visiting when his deployment schedule allowed. Agent Kwan became a friend, their occasional meetings evolving into genuine connection. Hawk recovered fully and returned to operational status, checking in regularly with updates about missions Margaret suspected were classified but appreciated anyway. And every year on the anniversary of that night, the nurses from Lakewood General sent her a card signed by every staff member who'd been there, reminding her that she'd made a difference, that her choice to fight had mattered. At 62, Lieutenant Colonel Margaret Flynn stood in front of a new class of medical students, her 15th cohort since returning to active duty, and began the same way she always did. "Welcome to Advanced Trauma Medicine. I'm Lieutenant Colonel Flynn. Over the next 16 weeks, I'm going to teach you how to save lives when everything says you should fail." The students leaned forward, eager and nervous and ready. Some of you will become surgeons. Some will specialize in emergency medicine. Some will deploy to combat zones while others work in civilian trauma centers. But all of you will face moments when someone's life depends entirely on your ability to perform under impossible pressure. She paused, letting them feel the weight of that responsibility. "I can't promise this course will be easy. I can't promise you won't question your abilities or doubt your decisions, but I can promise that if you commit to this training, if you push past your comfort zones and learn to trust your skills, you'll be ready for the worst day of your professional life." A hand went up. Margaret nodded. "Ma'am, is it true you performed surgery during a terrorist attack?" Margaret smiled slightly. "I performed surgery during what became a terrorist attack, and that experience taught me the most important lesson of combat medicine. You don't need perfect conditions to save lives. You just need courage, knowledge, and the refusal to give up." She moved to the board and began outlining the course curriculum, weeks of intensive training, simulations, practical exercises that would push these students to their absolute limits. By the time you leave this classroom, you'll know how to intubate in the dark, how to control hemorrhage with improvised equipment, how to make life or death decisions in seconds. You'll understand that medicine isn't just science, it's art, instinct, and will combined. The students were writing furiously, trying to capture every word. But more than techniques, you'll learn something crucial, that the quiet ones, the overlooked ones, the people everyone underestimates, they're often the strongest of all, because they've learned to be strong without anyone watching. They've practiced excellence in obscurity, and when the moment comes, they're ready. Margaret thought about the nurse she'd been 16 years ago, the woman everyone dismissed, the invisible protector who'd finally chosen to be seen. Never let anyone convince you that you're not capable. Never accept being made small to make others comfortable. And never, ever stop fighting for what matters. She met each student's eyes in turn, because the world needs people who stand up when it's easier to hide, who fight when it's safer to run, who protect the vulnerable even when the cost is high. That's what we do. That's who we are. And that's what I'm going to teach you to become. Outside the classroom window, Washington stretched toward the horizon, a city of power and potential, of people fighting daily battles large and small. Margaret had spent years hiding from that fight, convinced that invisibility was safety. She knew better now. The strongest people weren't always the loudest. The bravest weren't always the most obvious. And sometimes the greatest heroes were the ones everyone had overlooked until the moment courage became necessary. Margaret had been invisible for 16 years. Then she'd chosen to be seen, and in that choice, she'd found not just her purpose, but her power. The class ended. Students filed out, already discussing the challenges ahead. Margaret gathered her materials, preparing for the next lecture, the next training session, the next opportunity to shape the future of combat medicine. Her phone buzzed. Message from Morrison. "Hawk's team is deploying next month. He wanted you to know he's carrying techniques you taught into the field. Says he's going to save lives because you saved his." Margaret smiled and typed back, "That's how it works. We save each other. Pay it forward." She walked out of the classroom into the afternoon light, shoulders straight, head high, every inch the warrior she'd always been, but had forgotten to acknowledge. Behind her, the invisible nurse was gone. Ahead of her, the future stretched bright and uncompromising and full of possibility. Major Margaret Flynn, no, Lieutenant Colonel Margaret Flynn, wasn't running anymore. She was exactly where she belonged, and she was just getting started.